The helicopter blades cut humid air thick enough to choke on. Lance Corporal Thomas Sullivan, 19 years old and 3 months into his first tour, moved through elephant grass that reached his chest. The Mekong Delta stretched in every direction, green and hostile, and alive with things that wanted him dead. His rifle felt heavier with each step, not from weight, but from the understanding that every shadow might demand he use it. Marcus Chen walked 20 years old with a medic's bag slung across his narrow shoulders. They called him Doc, though he'd only finished 8 weeks of medical training before the Corps shipped him here. Doc moved like water fluid, uncertain, while Sullivan felt like stone rigid waiting to break. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through static, ordering them to investigate a village 3 clicks north. Intelligence suggested Viet Cong activity. Intelligence always suggested something. The patrol spread out, 10 Marines trying to look like they belonged in this green hell. Doc glanced back, caught Sullivan's eye flash that gap-toothed grin that made everyone feel safer. The kid from San Francisco who joined up because his father had fought in Korea and tradition mattered more than sense. Sullivan nodded back, tried to return the smile, felt his face crack around the edges of fear he couldn't quite swallow. The tree line erupted. Automatic weapons fire shredded the air where sound had been. Sullivan hit the dirt, tasted mud and copper, heard someone screaming. Doc went down hard, clutching his side, red, blooming through green fabric like a flower nobody wanted to see. Sullivan froze. 3 seconds. That's all it was? 3 seconds where his body refused orders from his brain, where terror locked every muscle where the world moved, and he stayed still. 3 seconds that felt like drowning in open air. Corporal Briggs charged past, grabbed Doc's collar, dragged him toward cover. Sullivan's legs finally remembered how to move. He fired blind into the tree line, heard his own voice shouting words that meant nothing, scrambled to where Briggs had pulled Doc behind a fallen log. Doc's eyes were open, blinking fast, blood pumping between fingers pressed against the wound. His lips moved, but Sullivan couldn't hear it over the gunfire and his own pulse hammering in his skull. The medic bag lay 3 feet away, dropped in the chaos. Sullivan reached for it. Doc's hand caught his wrist. The grip went slack. Medevac arrived 12 minutes later. Doc was already gone, eyes fixed on nothing, that gap-toothed smile erased by something that looked like surprise. Sullivan sat in the mud with Doc's blood on his hands, and those 3 seconds playing on repeat in his head. 3 seconds when he could have moved, should have moved, might have saved his best friend if his body hadn't betrayed him. Lieutenant Morrison said it wasn't Sullivan's fault. Briggs said there was nothing anyone could have done. The chaplain said God had a plan. Sullivan knew the truth. He'd frozen when Doc needed him, and that was the kind of truth that didn't wash off. October 15th, 2024. Maple Street in late afternoon looked like someone had dipped the whole world in honey golden light, turning ordinary things into lies about perfection. Thomas Sullivan sat on his porch, 68 years old and dying by inches, watching a little girl ride a pink bicycle down the sidewalk like physics couldn't touch her. The oxygen tank hissed beside his chair, mechanical breathing for lungs that had given up on the job. Stage 4 lung cancer metastasized, eating him from the inside out. 6 months, the doctor said. Maybe less if he didn't take care of himself. Sullivan had laughed at that. Taking care of himself hadn't been part of his vocabulary for 50 years. Sophie Hayes pedaled past Mrs. Chen's corner store, rang her bell at nothing in particular, waved at a cat in a window. 7 years old and convinced the world was safe. Sullivan envied that certainty. He'd lost it in a rice paddy half a century ago and never found it again. Movement caught his attention, a kid emerging from the alley between 5th and 6th, maybe 10 years old, clothes 3 sizes too big, shoes that didn't match. Sullivan recognized the look. He'd seen it in mirrors during the bad years after Vietnam, in the faces of brothers who came back broken, in men who'd learned that home wasn't always where you left it. The girl's hands went to her chest. Sullivan's body tensed before his brain caught up. The girl's pedaling, stuttered bicycle wobbling. Her face drained of color, that particular gray that meant the heart was giving up. Sullivan knew that color. He'd seen it on Doc's face 53 years ago. The girl fell. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just gone, consciousness severed, clean body crumpling like someone had cut her strings. The bicycle crashed, wheels spinning, pink streamers tangled in chrome. The kid from the alley ran. Sullivan's chest clenched. The boy dropped to his knees beside the girl, checked her breathing, tilted her head back, started chest compressions. The movements were precise, deliberate 30 compressions, then 2 breaths. Sullivan counted without meaning to muscle memory from first aid training that had come too late to help Doc. Jackson Hayes burst from his house across the street. Sullivan knew Jackson Hells Angels, vice president, good father, despite the patch man who kept his lawn perfect and his daughter safer. Jackson saw his daughter on the ground, saw a stranger's hands on her, and charged like a bull that didn't care about consequences. Sullivan's voice came out rough, scraped against vocal cords the cancer had half destroyed. Jackson stopped. Jackson's boots pounded pavement murders in his eyes, hands reaching for the kid's throat. The kid saving her. Jackson froze 3 feet from impact. His eyes found the compression pattern, the deliberate rhythm, the way the kid's whole body fought to keep Sophie's heart pumping blood her heart couldn't pump itself. Understanding crashed through rage. Jackson dropped to his knees, hands hovering over his daughter, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Sophie gasped. Small sound, wet intake of air, chest rising on its own authority. The kid kept compressions for 2 more cycles, making sure then pulled back. His hands shook so hard, his whole body vibrated with it. Sophie's eyes opened, confused and frightened and alive. Jackson gathered her up, checking her over, with trembling hands, this giant of a man, with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. His daughter breathed against his chest, asking what happened in a voice like broken glass, and Jackson couldn't answer, because his throat had closed around words too big to speak. Sullivan stood oxygen tank wheeling beside him, crossed the street with legs that barely remembered how. The kid had backed away, ready to run, looking at Jackson like he expected violence even now. Sullivan moved between them without planning to old instincts taking over. The kid's eyes met his. Terror mixed with exhaustion, mixed with something Sullivan recognized in every mirror, the desperate question of whether he'd done enough. Sullivan's hand extended workers' hands scarred by decades of motorcycle maintenance and bar fights and life that didn't care about gentle. Son, what you just did, that's the bravest thing I've seen in 50 years. The kid stared at the hand like it might burn him. Nobody had called him son in however long he'd been alone. Nobody had looked at him as anything but a problem to ignore or remove. The kid's hand moved small and dirty, and shaking closed around Sullivan's. Connection felt like electricity. Old man to young boy, broken veteran to invisible child. One moment of being seen cutting through decades of practiced invisibility. Jackson found his voice hoarse and wrecked. "Who are you?" The kid's whisper barely carried. "Nobody." Sullivan's grip tightened, not hard enough to hurt, firm enough to matter. "That's where you're wrong, kid." Evening found Sullivan alone in his house. Small brick structure he'd paid off 15 years ago through mechanic work and loyalty to brothers who'd kept him employed when nobody else would. The living room held ghosts more than furniture. Photos covered one wall. Vietnam Hells Angels runs family pictures that stopped abruptly in 1982 when family stopped meaning anything but failure. The photo Sullivan looked at most sat on the coffee table. Him and Doc Firebase Charlie Spring of 71. Both of them grinning at the camera like they'd lived forever, young enough to believe the lie. Doc's gap-toothed smile hadn't changed since they were kids in the same San Francisco neighborhood. Sullivan's face in the photo looked like a stranger's optimism he couldn't remember feeling. The oxygen tank hissed beside him, counterpoint to breathing that got harder each week. The cancer had started in his lungs, 30 years of cigarettes since Vietnam coming due with interest. Now it lived in his bones, his liver spreading like rumors nobody wanted to believe, but everyone knew were true. His daily bourbon sat untouched. Doctor said no alcohol with the medication. Sullivan usually ignored that advice, but tonight the whiskey tasted like cowardice. He set it down, picked up the photo instead. "I'm sorry, Marcus." 53 years of apologies hadn't changed anything. Doc stayed dead, Sullivan stayed guilty, and the 3 seconds he'd frozen played on repeat every night before sleep came. His phone rang, Jackson's name on the screen. Sullivan's voice came out steady despite the coughing fit he suppressed. "Yeah." Jackson spoke fast words tumbling over each other. "Gunner, you saved that kid from me today, but if you hadn't yelled, you would have stopped when you saw the seeper." "Maybe, maybe not. Where'd he go?" "Ran off before the ambulance came. Kid moves like smoke." Silence on the line, heavy with things that Jackson wasn't saying. "Finally, we gotta find him. He saved Sophie." Sullivan coughed, tasted copper, swallowed it. "Yeah, we do." More silence. Then Jackson's voice dropped, losing the desperate edge, finding something harder underneath. Hospital said Sophie's got long QT syndrome, genetic heart arrhythmia. Without CPR, she'd have died on that sidewalk. Brain damage minimum. That kid, whoever he is, he gave me my daughter back. Sullivan closed his eyes, saw Doc bleeding out in the mud. I'll find him. Gunner, you're sick. Let the brothers. I said I'll find him. The tone allowed no argument. Jackson knew better than to push when Sullivan used that voice. They'd ridden together 12 years vice president and road captain until cancer forced Sullivan to step back and Jackson to step up. Brotherhood ran deeper than rank. Why you, Gunner? Sullivan looked at Doc's photo, at his own young face full of confidence that hadn't survived the war. That kid did what I couldn't do 50 years ago. He didn't freeze. He saved someone. I owe him. Jackson's breath came heavy through the phone. Okay, but Gunner, don't die doing this. Sullivan almost laughed. Dying's the one thing I'm definitely doing. Question is whether I do anything worth a damn first. He hung up before Jackson could respond, sat in silence, broken only by the oxygen tank's mechanical wheeze. The bourbon called to him. He ignored it, stood with effort that cost more each day, moved to his bedroom. The desk drawer held envelopes. He pulled out a fresh one, wrote across the front in handwriting that shook more than he wanted to admit. For Dylan, if I don't make it. He didn't know the kid's name yet, but Dylan felt right. Old name, strong name for someone who'd survived what shouldn't be survived. Sullivan stared at the blank paper inside the envelope, trying to find words for a child he'd barely met, trying to compress 53 years of lessons into something that might matter. Finally, he wrote, "Kid, don't freeze when someone needs you. I did once. Carry that my whole life. You didn't. That makes you braver than me. Hold on to that." He sealed it, put it in the drawer with his will and the letter he'd written to Michael that he'd never send. Some conversations were too late to have. The phone rang again. He almost didn't answer, but the Hells Angels patch came with obligations that didn't end just because you were dying. Reaper's voice, sergeant at arms man, who'd pulled Sullivan out of more bar fights than either could count. "Church tonight," Jackson called it. "About the kid. I'll be there." "You sure? You sound like shit." "I always sound like shit." "What time?" 8. "You need a ride." Pride wanted to say no. Reality made him say yes. Riding his motorcycle these days meant dying on the road instead of in bed, and he had things to finish first. "Yeah, thanks, brother." "Always." Saying. The clubhouse sat on the edge of town, converted warehouse with Hells Angels Maple Street chapter painted across the brick in letters 10 feet tall. 23 motorcycles lined the parking lot, chrome gleaming under sodium lights that turned night into artificial day. Sullivan walked in with his oxygen tank wheeling behind him, portable reminder that the Reaper wore a cut these days. The brothers stood when he entered, respect that had nothing to do with his current rank and everything to do with who he'd been when he'd earned his patch in '74. Jackson stood at the head of the table, VP patch prominent on his vest. The seat beside him sat empty. President had died 6 months ago, natural causes at 73, and the chapter hadn't voted on replacement yet. Some things took time. Reaper, tiny snake wrench. 40 other names earned through blood and loyalty sat around the scarred wooden table. Men ranging from 25 to 70, bound by codes they didn't always follow but always believed in. Jackson's voice carried the weight of a man who'd almost lost everything. "Brothers, I need your help. Today, a kid maybe 10 years old, homeless from the look of him, saved Sophie's life. Performed perfect CPR while she was in cardiac arrest, then vanished before I could thank him. We need to find him." Murmurs rippled around the table. Tiny leaned forward, 6'4" and 260 despite the ironic nickname. "So we're looking for a 10-year-old homeless kid in this city. That's a needle in a haystack made of needles." Jackson nodded. "I know, but he's out there, alone, and he deserves better than that." Snake Road captain, since Sullivan stepped down, spoke up. "What's the plan when we find him?" Jackson's jaw set. "We bring him home. We protect him. He saved one of ours. That makes him one of ours." Reaper's scarred knuckles drummed the table. "You thinking adoption?" "I'm thinking family. However that looks." The room went quiet. Hells Angels didn't do things like this. They took care of their own, sure, defended their territory, lived by codes outsiders called criminal. But adopting a random homeless kid, that was new territory. Sullivan stood, oxygen tank hissing louder in the silence. I'll find him. All eyes turned. Reaper leaned back, arms crossed. Gunner, you're sick. Let the younger brothers handle the legwork. Sullivan's voice came out flat, allowing no argument. I said I'll find him. Jackson's eyes narrowed, reading something in Sullivan's face that others missed. Why you Gunner? Sullivan looked at each brother in turn, men who'd stood beside him through decades of choices that ranged from questionable to outright illegal. They deserved truth even if it cost him. Because that kid did what I couldn't. March 71, Mekong Delta. My best friend took enemy fire. I froze. 3 seconds, but it was enough. Another Marine saved him, but Doc died anyway. I've carried those 3 seconds, 53 years. He paused, let the weight settle. Today that kid didn't freeze. 10 years old, homeless, probably terrified, and he didn't run. He saved Sophie while Jackson charged at him ready to fight. That takes courage I didn't have at 19 with the rifle and a squad backing me up. I need to find him. Need to tell him that matters. The room stayed quiet. These men knew Sullivan's history, knew about Vietnam, the way you know about scars without needing to see them form. But hearing it spoken plain cut deeper than implication. Reaper spoke first. Motion to make finding and protecting this kid club business. All in favor, 23 hands raised, not a single dissent. Brotherhood meant showing up when it mattered, and something about Sullivan's naked honesty made this matter. Jackson's voice carried formal weight. Motion passes. Gunner takes point. Rest of us support however he needs. Questions. Wrench, oldest brother after Sullivan at 65, cleared his throat. What if the kid doesn't want help? Lots of street kids, they run from anyone official looking. We roll up in cuts, might scare him worse. Sullivan nodded. That's why it's me. I'm not intimidating anymore. Dying man with an oxygen tank, kid might actually listen. Dark humor rippled through the room, the kind of laughter that acknowledged pain without dwelling on it. Sullivan sat back down, exhaustion hitting like a physical weight. The meeting continued, planning logistics he'd handle later, but his mind was already elsewhere. Finding one invisible kid in a city of 500,000. Might as well find a specific raindrop in a storm. But Sullivan had time, not much but enough, and nothing to lose except a death he was having anyway. The meeting ended near midnight. Brothers filtered out, engines roaring to life, 23 men heading home to families or empty beds or whatever waited in the dark. Reaper drove Sullivan home in his truck motorcycle strapped in back. Both men quiet with thoughts they didn't share. Sullivan's house felt colder than when he'd left. He fed the oxygen tank a fresh cylinder, took his evening medications that did nothing except make dying slower, stood at his bedroom window looking at stars he couldn't see through light pollution. Doc's face floated in memory, young and grinning, and convinced they'd both make it home. Sullivan had made it home. He'd just never really arrived. Tomorrow he'd start searching. Libraries, shelters, soup kitchens, anywhere a scared kid might hide. The city was big, but communities were small, and everyone noticed things they pretended not to see. Sullivan had 53 years of practice reading those things. He pulled out the envelope he'd written earlier, added a line, P.S. Whatever your real name is, I'm calling you Dylan. Feels right. Hope you don't mind. Sleep came hard, interrupted by coughing fits and pain the morphine dulled, but couldn't erase. His dreams mixed past and present, Doc's death, and Sophie's collapse, 3 seconds of freezing, stretched into decades of guilt. He woke at dawn, body reminding him that dying was active work requiring constant attention. Coffee helped. Bourbon would have helped more, but he left it alone. The kid deserved someone sober when Sullivan found him. The public library opened at 9. Sullivan waited in the parking lot, oxygen tank beside him, in Reaper's lone truck, watching people filter in, mostly older folks, some students, nobody who looked like a homeless 10-year-old. He gave it an hour, then went inside. The library held that particular smell of old books and desperate hope, places people went when they needed something life wasn't providing. Sullivan moved slowly, conserving energy, checking corners and alcoves where someone small might hide. He found Dylan in the back corner, tucked into an oversized chair, with a book open in his lap. The kid looked smaller than yesterday, like he was trying to fold himself into invisibility, take up minimum space in a world that preferred he took up none. Sullivan stopped 10 feet away, not approaching, just present. Dylan's head snapped up, eyes going wide, body tensing to run. Sullivan held perfectly still the way you freeze when you encounter a deer on a trail, knowing sudden movement means it's gone. Nothing happened. Sullivan didn't speak, didn't advance, didn't do anything except pull out the book he grabbed from a random shelf and sit down on the floor opposite Dylan's chair. His knees protested, his back screamed. The oxygen tank clattered louder than he'd wanted, but he got himself seated. He opened the book turned out to be a field guide to North American birds and pretended to read. His peripheral vision tracked Dylan watching for signs the kid would bolt. None came. The tension didn't leave the kid's body, but running apparently wasn't immediate. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. Sullivan turned pages without reading them, giving Dylan space to decide what happened next. The library hummed with quiet activity, people moving through aisles, keyboards, clicking, life continuing around two people sitting in silence. At 30 minutes, Sullivan reached into his jacket, moved slow and deliberate, pulled out a sandwich he'd bought from the deli on the way. Turkey and cheese chips, an apple, a bottle of water. He set them on the floor between himself and Dylan, then went back to his book. Dylan stared at the food like it might vanish or explode. Sullivan kept his eyes on the field guide, giving the kid privacy to want what he clearly needed. At 45 minutes, Dylan whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Sullivan closed the book, met the kid's eyes for the first time. Exhaustion lived there, the kind that came from carrying weights too heavy for anyone, let alone a 10-year-old. Because someone should have helped me when I was lost. Dylan processed that. You were homeless. Different kind of lost, but lost is lost. The kid's hand moved hesitant toward the sandwich. Sullivan looked away, giving him the dignity of not being watched while he took what he needed. Paper rustled. The kid ate like someone who didn't know when food might come again, quick, efficient, no enjoyment except the necessity of fuel. Sullivan waited until Dylan had finished half the sandwich before speaking again. Your daughter okay? The assumption that Sophie was Sullivan's daughter almost made him correct it. Then he realized the truth was more complicated than genetics. She's perfect because of you. Dylan chewed, swallowed, looked at his hands. I learned at CPR 6 months ago. Why? The question hung between them, heavier than it sounded. Dylan's eyes went distant, seeing something that wasn't the library. My mom had a heart attack when I was 8. I didn't know what to do. She died. Sullivan's chest tightened, not from cancer, but from recognition. Different specifics, same shape of loss. I'm sorry. I promised myself that I'd be ready next time. So I paid attention when the shelter lady taught CPR, practiced till I could do it perfect. You did it perfect yesterday, saved Sophie's life. Dylan looked up, needing to know if that was true or just something adults said. The doctor confirmed it. Without CPR, she'd have died. You gave her back to her father. Something changed in Dylan's face, tension releasing by degrees. Sullivan recognized that look too. The desperate need to believe your suffering had purpose, that pain could be transformed into something useful. They sat in silence while Dylan finished eating. Sullivan let his breathing steady, conserving energy he'd need later. The oxygen tank hissed its mechanical rhythm, countdown to nothing. When Dylan spoke again, his voice carried weight beyond his years. Are you sick? Yeah. Bad sick. Dying sick. Cancer. Dylan absorbed that, no shock or pity, just processing another hard truth in a life that seemed full of them. How long gone? Doctor says 6 months. I'm aiming for 6 months and 1 day. Like to prove him wrong. Almost a smile flickered across Dylan's face there and gone like sunlight through clouds. You're not scared. Sullivan considered lying, decided the kid deserved honesty. Of dying, numb. Dying's easy. It's living that's hard. I'm scared of not doing one last good thing before I go. What thing? Sullivan looked at Dylan, this small boy who'd performed perfect CPR while a giant charged at him, who'd survived on streets that ate adults, who'd learned to be invisible because visible meant vulnerable. Haven't figured that out yet, but I think maybe it involves you, Tim. 3 more days of finding Dylan at the library. Same routine. Sullivan arrived, sat opposite, shared food, let silence do most of the talking. Gradually, Dylan's defensive posture softened. Not gone, never gone, but less like a spring wound so tight it might shatter. On the 4th day, Dylan spoke without being asked. Foster care was worse than streets. Sullivan waited. The kid would talk or wouldn't, but pushing never helped. 3 homes in 2 years. First one, they took the state money and spent it on themselves. Made me sleep in the basement. Second one, the dad hit me. Third one, Dylan stopped, couldn't or wouldn't say more. Sullivan filled in blanks from experience with brothers who'd cycled through the system. The third one was probably the worst, the one that made streets look safe by comparison. So you ran? Yeah, 6 months ago. Been making it work. Making it work meant sleeping in condemned buildings, eating from shelters, dodging police and social workers and anyone with authority to drag him back to places that called themselves homes but were just prettier prisons. Sullivan shifted his back, reminding him that sitting on library floors at 68 with stage 4 cancer was poor planning. I got a question. Don't have to answer if you don't want. Dylan nodded. Jackson Sophie's dad wants you to meet her. She's been asking about the angel boy who saved her. Made you something. Kid won't stop talking about it. Fear flashed across Dylan's face. I can't. If I meet them, they'll call social services. I'll get sent back. Sullivan raised a hand, gentle stop sign. Jackson won't do that, I promise. He just wants to say thank you. His daughter wants to say thank you. You can leave anytime, no pressure, no traps. Dylan looked at Sullivan with eyes that had learned not to trust promises. You'll be there. Yeah, I'll be there. And if they try to make me stay, then we leave, you and me. I'm dying anyway. Nothing they can do to me that cancer isn't already doing. The logic was sound in a dark way. Dylan seemed to recognize that the freedom that came from having nothing to lose. Okay, but just dinner. Then I go. Just dinner. Then you go. Jackson's house sat modest on Maple Street, brick exterior that needed tuck pointing, yard that somehow stayed green despite October, the kind of place that whispered working-class dignity. Sullivan pulled up in Reaper's truck, Dylan rigid in the passenger seat, ready to run, despite the promise. Sophie must have been watching from the window because the front door flew open before they'd even parked. She ran toward the truck, 7 years old with dark curls bouncing alive and perfect and completely unaware how close she'd come to not being. Dylan opened the truck door slowly, uncertain how to meet someone he'd saved. Sophie solved that problem by launching herself at him, arms wrapping around his waist, face pressed against his chest. You're the angel boy Daddy said you saved my life. Dylan's hands hovered, not sure where to put them, how to accept gratitude without breaking under the weight of it. Sullivan saw the moment Dylan gave up fighting and just held her back, this small girl who'd been dying on concrete 4 days ago. Jackson appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with something that looked like tears he refused to shed. He caught Sullivan's eye, nodded thanks that couldn't be spoken. Sullivan nodded back, brothers communicating in silence the way they'd learned over years of riding together. Sophie pulled Dylan toward the house, chattering about what she'd made for him, something about construction paper and markers and the best metal in the world. Dylan glanced back at Sullivan, checking if this was real or trap. Sullivan followed oxygen tank rolling over sidewalk cracks, body moving through exhaustion that was becoming baseline. Inside smelled like home spaghetti sauce, garlic bread, something baking. Jackson had cleaned surfaces, scrubbed dishes, put away the kind of preparation that meant this mattered. Sullivan appreciated that. Detail showed respect. Sophie dragged Dylan to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair for him, with ceremony usually reserved for royalty. A construction paper medal lay on the plate, or at that spot, gold crayon forming a circle, carefully printed letters spelling out "World's Best Hero." Dylan picked it up with hands that shook, stared at it like he'd never seen anything so valuable. His eyes went wet. He blinked fast, trying to hide it, failing completely. You made this? Sophie nodded, proud and certain. You're a hero. Heroes get medals. This is yours. Dylan's voice came out broken. I'm not. I just did what I learned. Jackson spoke from the stove, not turning around, giving Dylan privacy while he broke. You did what most people couldn't. That makes you a hero in this house. Dinner happened in waves. Sophie talked enough for everyone, filling silence with stories about school and friends and her bicycle that she wasn't allowed to ride until the doctor said okay. Dylan ate slowly, like he expected the food to be snatched away, watching doors and windows with the awareness of someone who'd learned exits mattered more than comfort. Sullivan watched both of them. Dylan figuring out what normal looked like, Jackson trying to show gratitude without being overwhelming. Two people attempting connection across a gap carved by circumstance. After dinner, Sophie showed Dylan her room stuffed animals arranged by size drawings, covering walls, a 7-year-old's kingdom built from imagination and safety. Dylan stood in the doorway like he might contaminate it by entering this space so different from condemned buildings and library corners. Sullivan and Jackson ended up on the porch, two men with beer between them, evening air carrying the smell of cut grass and approaching winter. Jackson spoke first. "Thank you for finding him." "Had to. Kid saved Sophie." "It's more than that. You see something in him." Sullivan took a breath that rattled cough-tasted copper. "Yeah, I see someone who didn't freeze when freezing would have been easy. See someone who chose hard, right over easy wrong. See what I wish I'd been at 19. Jackson processed that, connecting dots he'd suspected but never confirmed. "Vietnam. Yeah, I lost my best friend because I froze. 3 seconds. Carried it 53 years. That why you're doing this redemption?" Sullivan thought about lying, decided against it. "Maybe, or maybe I'm dying and want to leave one thing behind that isn't a mistake. Dylan could be that thing." Jackson drank silence, settling between them like dust. "He can't live on the streets. It's getting cold. He'll die out there." "I know. You thinking what I'm thinking?" Sullivan looked at Jackson, saw the proposal forming before it was spoken. "If you're thinking about asking a dying man with PTSD and a criminal record to help raise a traumatized 10-year-old, then yeah, probably thinking the same thing." Jackson almost smiled. "That's exactly what I'm thinking. Kid needs family. We're offering. We both know what social services will say. Then we don't ask permission. We just do it." Sullivan's chest tightened with something that wasn't cancer. Hope, maybe, or the recognition that doing right sometimes meant doing illegal. Kids gotta choose. Can't force family on someone who's learned family hurts. "Agreed," we ask. "He decides." They sat in silence, two men planning minor kidnapping, disguised as care, knowing full well the system would call it abduction and them criminals. But the system had already failed Dylan 3 times. Maybe criminals could succeed where the system hadn't. Dylan appeared at the door, Sophie's hand in his construction paper medal pinned to his oversized shirt. His eyes found Sullivan. "Can we go now?" Sullivan stood, joints protesting. "Yeah, kid, let's go." They said goodbyes, Jackson's hand on Dylan's shoulder. Sophie hugging him one more time, promises that he could come back whenever he wanted. Dylan nodded like he didn't quite believe it, followed Sullivan to the truck. They drove in silence for 3 blocks. Then Dylan spoke. "They were nice." "Yeah, they were." "That makes it harder." "Makes what harder?" "Knowing there is people like that, and I can't have them. That I'll go back to the library tomorrow, and it'll be like tonight didn't happen." Sullivan pulled the truck over, parked in a lot behind a closed grocery store. He turned to face Dylan, oxygen tank hissing between them. "What if it didn't have to be like that?" Dylan's eyes narrowed, defensive mechanisms activating. "What do you mean? What if you didn't go back to the library? What if you came home with me?" "Home. I got a house, extra bedroom. Needs work, but it's got a bed and a door that locks. No foster parents, no system, no rules except don't steal and don't lie. Just a place while we figure things out." Dylan stared at Sullivan like he was speaking a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm dying and you're surviving, and maybe we can help each other. You give me someone to teach, I give you somewhere safe to sleep. Nobody needs to know. Just two people making life less hard." "But you said you're dying in 6 months." "Yeah, so for 6 months you got a place. That's 6 months longer than you got right now." Dylan looked out the window, processing calculations Sullivan couldn't see, but understood. Risk versus reward. Known danger versus unknown kindness. The math of survival never came out clean. Finally, Dylan's voice came out small. "What happens after 6 months?" "Then Jackson takes over. He already offered. But that's future. Right now, I'm offering present. A bed, a door, a place that's yours." Dylan turned back, eyes wet with tears he wouldn't let fall. "I don't want you to die." Sullivan felt something crack in his chest, not cancer, but something deeper. "I don't want to die either, kid. But wanting doesn't change it. I got maybe 6 months. Rather spend it with someone who matters than alone. You matter. Yesterday proved that. I'm not your son. No, but maybe you could be my last good thing." The words hung between them, offer and plea wrapped together. Dylan's face twisted, fighting emotions he couldn't name, trying to protect himself from hope that might shatter worse than despair. Okay. One word, barely audible, but it changed everything. Sullivan nodded, put the truck in gear, drove toward his house with a passenger who might become family or might disappear tomorrow. Either way, he'd offered. Dylan had accepted. That was more than most people got. His house looked smaller, with Dylan standing in it, seen through eyes that expected to be disappointed. Sullivan showed him the spare room bed with clean sheets, dresser with empty drawers, window that actually locked. The kind of basic that meant luxury to someone who'd been sleeping on cardboard. Dylan set down his backpack, the only possessions he had, looked around like waiting for the trap to spring. It's really mine. It's really yours. What if I mess up? Then you mess up. I've messed up plenty. Still here. Dylan sat on the bed, testing it, finding it solid. His hands smoothed the blanket, careful, reverent, like touching something sacred. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Be someone's whatever this is. Sullivan leaned against the doorframe oxygen tank, reminding him standing costs more these days. Me either, kid. We'll figure it out together. Shay. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Sullivan woke to find Dylan already up, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the construction paper metal like it might vanish. Coffee brewed in the pot. Dylan had figured out the machine somehow made it strong the way Sullivan liked, without being told. Couldn't sleep. Dylan shook his head. Beds are weird after months of floors. Sullivan poured coffee, offered a cup to Dylan, who shook his head. 10 years old was too young for coffee, even if life had aged him past his years. Give it a week. You'll adjust. What if I don't want to adjust? What if getting comfortable makes it hurt worse when it's over? Sullivan sat down across from Dylan, recognized the defense mechanism. Don't let yourself want things. Wanting meant losing hurt more. Maybe, or maybe 6 months of comfort is worth the hurt after. Only you can decide that. Dylan looked at him, really looked, seeing past the oxygen tank and the cancer and the dying to whatever lived underneath. You scared of dying, no? I've been dying since Vietnam, just taking a long time about it. I'm scared of wasting what's left. Is helping me wasting it? Sullivan reached across the table, gripped Dylan's shoulder. Felt bones too prominent under skin too thin. Kid, you're the opposite of waste, your purpose. Maybe the only purpose I got left. Dylan's eyes filled but didn't spill. He nodded once, sharp, accepting something he didn't have words for. Okay. Okay, what? Okay, I'll try. The adjusting thing, the staying thing, I'll try my... Sullivan squeezed his shoulder, once let go. That's all anyone can do. Try. They sat in silence, morning light cutting through kitchen windows, two people starting something neither understood. Sullivan's phone buzzed, Jackson wanting to know how things went. He typed back one word. Good. Good didn't cover it, but language failed around things that mattered. Dylan was here safe, eating breakfast Sullivan made from eggs that were only slightly burned. 6 months didn't seem like enough time to teach everything the kid needed. But 6 months was what they had, so Sullivan would make it count. The oxygen tank hissed its mechanical countdown. Dylan glanced at it, then away, not asking questions Sullivan was grateful not to answer. Some truths were too heavy to speak over breakfast. Outside, November waited with cold that would get colder, winter approaching like a deadline nobody wanted. But inside, warmth, held for now, coffee, eggs, the simple mathematics of not being alone. Sullivan looked at Dylan, this kid who'd saved a life while homeless, who'd learned CPR because his mother died. And he'd promised himself never again, who'd chosen to stay with a dying stranger because staying was less terrifying than going back to streets. Maybe redemption looked like this. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but quiet mornings where doing right meant scrambling eggs for someone who needed them. Not fixing the past, but building something in present that might survive into future. Good enough. It would have to be. 3 days built rhythm, neither expected. Dylan woke before Sullivan made coffee without being asked. Sat at the kitchen table like he was practicing being permanent. Sullivan taught him how to change motorcycle oil in the garage, how to cook 3 meals that didn't come from cans, how to exist in space without apologizing for taking it up. Small lessons, deliberate, the kind that stuck because they came wrapped in grease and morning light instead of lectures. On the 4th morning, the knock came. Sullivan answered with oxygen tank trailing behind like a mechanical shadow. The woman on his porch wore a professional smile and clipboard armor, everything about her screaming government authority. Dylan appeared in this hallway, saw her, went pale. Rachel Bennett's voice carried practiced sympathy that had calcified into protocol over 11 years. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Rachel Bennett, Child Protective Services. I need to ask you some questions about Dylan Carter. Sullivan's jaw set. He's safe here. I'm sure he is. But safe isn't the same as legal. May I come in? Dylan had already moved toward the back door, fight or flight instinct, choosing flight. Sullivan caught his eye, shook his head once. Running made things worse. Dylan stopped trapped between door and woman, with clipboard, body vibrating with need to disappear. Rachel entered without waiting for invitation, took in the scene with eyes trained to catalog risk factors. Oxygen tank medication bottles on counter, Hell's Angels vest hanging by the door. Child clearly ready to bolt. Her internal checklist filled itself. Dylan, I'm Rachel. I work with children to make sure they're okay. Can we talk? Dylan said nothing, looked at Sullivan for permission to exist. Sullivan nodded. Dylan sat at the kitchen table, hands in his lap, making himself small. Rachel sat across from him, maintained non-threatening posture that somehow threatened everything. How long have you been staying here? 3 days. And before that, silence. Dylan, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I need to understand your situation. More silence. Rachel turned to Sullivan, shifted tactics. Mr. Sullivan, are you Dylan's legal guardian? No. Do you have permission from his legal guardian? He doesn't have one. Parents dead, foster care failed 3 times, been on streets 6 months. Rachel wrote notes, pen scratching judgments onto paper. And you thought the appropriate response was to bring him here without contacting proper authorities. Sullivan's voice stayed level despite the anger underneath. Proper authorities put him in homes where he got neglected and hit. Streets were safer. That tell you something about your system. Mr. Sullivan, I understand you mean well. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're about to drag a kid back into a system that's failed him repeatedly. That's not meaning well. That's following procedure off a cliff. Rachel's professional mask cracked slightly, showing something human underneath. She looked at Dylan, really looked, saw the terror mixed with resignation of someone who'd been through this before. Dylan, are you happy here? Dylan's voice came out barely audible. Yes. Does Mr. Sullivan hurt you? No. Does he give you food, a safe place to sleep? Yes. Rachel closed her notebook, conflict playing across her face. Then protocol reasserted itself, pushed humanity back into its box. Mr. Sullivan, you have criminal record, history of violence. You're terminally ill, and Dylan is unaccompanied minor in need of proper placement. I'm going to have to. Lady, I'm dying in 6 months. Whatever threat you think I am, cancer's handling it. Kid needs somewhere safe for that time. Then he goes to Jackson Hayes. We are handling it. Your system had its chance. That's not how this works. Maybe it should be. Rachel stood, decision made, despite the doubt Sullivan saw in her eyes. Dylan, you'll need to come with me, just temporarily while we sort things out. Dylan's hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. No, please. This is my home. I know this is hard, but you don't know. Dylan's voice rose, cracking. You don't know what it's like when they send you back, when they promise temporary and it turns into years, when temporary means nobody cares enough to make permanent. Rachel's face softened, but her clipboard stayed firm. I understand, but the law is clear. Sullivan moved between them, not threatening, just present. Give us till Monday. Court hearing proper and legal. Let the judge decide. Just don't take him today. Mr. Sullivan, please, you take him. Now he runs, I know it. You know it. Let him stay here supervised if you want until court decides. That's fair. Rachel looked between Sullivan and Dylan, saw something in both their faces that made her hesitate. Protocol said take the child now. Experience suggested Sullivan was right about the running. Supervised visits. I come by daily. Court hearing Monday morning. If you disappear before then, I will find you. Sullivan nodded. We'll be here. Rachel left with Dylan still at the table, her car pulling away, with the weight of decisions that wouldn't feel right either way. Dylan's breathing came fast and shallow, panic attack building. She's taking me Monday. Sullivan sat down across from him, chose honesty over comfort. Maybe, or maybe we win. Either way, we fight till we can't. What if fighting isn't enough? Then we lose fighting not because we gave up. Dylan looked at Sullivan with eyes that had seen too many people give up. You promise you won't give up? Sullivan extended his hand across the table worker's hands scarred by decades. I promise I won't give up till I'm dead. After that, Jackson takes over. You're not going back to streets or foster care. That's a promise I'll keep, even if I'm dying making it. Dylan's hand closed around Sullivan's grip, desperate. Okay, so. That afternoon brought Jackson and 23 motorcycles. They parked in Sullivan's driveway, and down the street, Chrome armies showing up because one of theirs needed backup. Jackson entered first, saw Dylan's face, understood without asking. CPS came. Sullivan nodded. Court Monday. Rachel Bennett, caseworker. By the book type. Sees risks, not reasons. Reaper followed Jackson in his scarred face, hard with anger. We don't let them take our brother. We fight legal. Sullivan's voice carried weight that shut down other options. Clean fight. No threats, no intimidation. Dylan needs to win, right? Not win scared. The living room filled with leather and tattoos and men who'd done questionable things in service of brotherhood. Dylan watched from the kitchen, seeing this army materialize because of him trying to process that kind of loyalty. Jackson pulled out his phone, dialed a number. Carlos, it's Jackson Hayes. Need your services. Family court emergency guardianship hearing Monday morning. Kid's life depends on it. Pause while Carlos Mendez talked on the other end. Yeah, I know it's short notice. That's why I'm calling you. You're the best. Another pause. Money's not an issue. Get us prepared. Jackson hung up, looked at Sullivan. Carlos will be here tonight. Start building the case. What's the case? Dylan's voice came from the kitchen doorway. That I'm broken and Gunner's dying and nobody wants me anyway. Jackson crossed the room. Knelt so he was eye level with Dylan. The case is you saved my daughter's life. That makes you family. And we don't abandon family because the system says we should. But I'm not really family. I'm just some kid you feel sorry for. You're some kid who performed perfect CPR while I was charging at you ready to fight. That takes more courage than most men show in a lifetime. You're family because you earned it. Now we're fighting to prove that legally. Dylan's eyes filled but didn't spill. What if we lose? Then we lose. But we lose fighting not because we accepted it. Sullivan coughed, tasted copper, swallowed it. The brothers pretended not to notice, gave him dignity of suffering without audience. Dylan noticed, though, saw the blood. Sullivan palmed away, understood the timeline they were racing against. Carlos Mendez arrived at 7, lawyer in his 50s, with sharp suit and sharper mind. He spread documents across Sullivan's dining table, started building defense against system designed to protect children by removing them from anyone unofficial. Here's what we're facing. Rachel will argue Dylan's in high-risk environment. Thomas Sullivan, Vietnam veteran with PTSD diagnosis, multiple arrests in the 70s and 80s, estranged from own son terminal cancer. Jackson Hayes, criminal record. Hells Angels vice president. On paper, you look like exactly who children need protection from. Jackson's jaw clenched. And in reality is you're giving Dylan what the system couldn't: safety, belonging, purpose. But we need to prove that. Need character witnesses, medical documentation, evidence of Dylan's transformation. We have 72 hours. The room mobilized. Reaper called Mrs. Patricia Wilson, the CPR instructor, from the shelter. Tiny tracked down Tommy Briggs at his bike shop. Snake reached out to the school principal. Wrench contacted Sophie's doctor. 23 men working phones and favors building, case that family meant more than paperwork. Dylan watched from the kitchen, overwhelmed by the machinery moving on his behalf. Sullivan joined him carrying 2 sodas. Lot of people, huh? Why are they doing this? Because you're worth doing it for. I'm not, Sullivan cut him off. Kid you are, get that through your head. You're worth fighting for. These men don't do things halfway. You're family now, whether you believe it yet or not. Dylan took the soda, held the cold can like an anchor. Gunner, yeah. If we lose Monday, if they take me, will you visit? Sullivan's chest tightened. Not cancer, but something worse. If we lose Monday, I'm going with you wherever they send you. They can arrest me, sue me, throw me in jail. I'm dying anyway. Might as well die making sure you're okay. You'd do that. Kid, I'd do worse than that. You gave me purpose in my last 6 months. That's worth protecting. Saturday morning, Sullivan's phone rang before dawn. Michael Sullivan's name on the screen, the son who hadn't called in 15 years, suddenly calling at 5:30 in the morning. Sullivan answered, voice rough from sleep and cancer. Michael. Dad. The word came hard, unused muscle working. Hospital called my office yesterday, said you're not doing treatment. They wanted to know if family would intervene. And I didn't know what to see because I don't know if I count as family anymore. Sullivan sat up, oxygen tank wheezing beside the bed. You count, always did. I just wasn't good at showing it. Silence on the line, heavy with 15 years of not talking. They said you've got weeks, not months anymore. Weeks. Yeah, cancer's accelerating. Stress maybe. Or just time's up. And you're spending it fighting for some random kid instead of... Michael's voice cracked. Instead of calling me... Sullivan closed his eyes, saw his son's face at 5 years old before divorce, and drinking destroyed what should have been father and son. Would you have wanted that, me calling because I'm dying wanting forgiveness on my deathbed? I don't know. Maybe. At least I'd have the choice. Fair point. Sullivan had no defense. You're right. I should have called. I'm sorry. Do you even remember why I stopped talking to you? Because I was terrible father, drank too much, wasn't there when you needed me, let my demons eat me instead of being present for you. Close. I stopped talking because you said you loved the club more than you loved me. Christmas dinner, 1999. I asked you to skip one run, just one, to be there for my law school graduation. You said the club came first. Always. Sullivan remembered. He'd been drunk, angry at something he couldn't name, had said things that felt totally then and unforgivable now. I was wrong. Were you? Because it looks like you are putting club first. Fighting for this kid because Jackson asked. Because brotherhood matters more than no. Sullivan's voice came out hard. I'm fighting for Dylan because he did what I couldn't do 50 years ago. Because he didn't freeze when someone needed him. Because maybe if I can teach him what I learned too late, I leave something behind that isn't failure. Michael breathed on the other end, processing. You couldn't save your friend in Vietnam, so you're saving this kid instead. Yeah, pretty much. That doesn't fix what you did to me. No, nothing does. But Michael, Sullivan coughed, fought through it. Dylan's going to lose me in weeks, just like you lost me, but slower. Maybe worse. If there's anything you learned about having father who failed you, anything that might help him deal with that. You want me to help the kid you're choosing over me? The question hung sharp between them. I'm not choosing him over you. I'm trying to do right by both of you. Probably failing at both, but trying. More silence. Then Michael's voice came quieter, some of the anger bleeding out. What do you need? Sullivan almost dropped the phone. What? For court Monday. What do you need? And Michael, you don't have to. That kid doesn't deserve to pay for your shit. He's innocent in all this. So what do you need? Sullivan's throat closed around words too big to speak. Character witnesses, evidence I'm not complete disaster. Maybe if you wanted testimony that even though I failed you, I'm trying not to fail him. You want me to stand up in court and say my father was terrible, but he's better now. No, I want you to tell the truth, whatever that is. If the truth is I was terrible and I'm still terrible, say that. Dylan deserves honesty more than he deserves me looking good. Michael breathed into silence for a long moment. I'll be there Monday. Michael, don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because that kid deserves someone who understands what it's like to have you as a father. Someone who can maybe help him survive it. The line went dead. Sullivan sat in the dark with his phone and his oxygen tank and the understanding that redemption looked like your estranged son offering to help despite having every reason not to. Dylan appeared in the doorway, backlit by hallway light. Who was that? My son. He's coming Monday. I didn't know you had a son. Yeah, Michael, 47, lawyer. Haven't talked to him in 15 years. Why not? Sullivan looked at Dylan, decided honesty was all he had left to give. Because I was terrible father. Put everything before him, drinking, clubbed my own pain. He grew up with ghost instead of dad. Eventually he stopped trying to make the ghost solid. But he's coming Monday. Yeah. Why we? Sullivan stood, joints protesting, moved to stand beside Dylan's in the doorway. Because even though I failed him, he's better man than I ever was. And he knows you need someone who understands what it's like to lose father you never really had. Dylan processed that, connecting dots to his own losses. Will he hate me? Might. You're getting attention he never got. Time I never gave him. That's hard to watch when you're the one who went without. Then why's he helping? Because Michael learned something I never taught him. That pain doesn't mean you stop caring. That being hurt doesn't make you hurt others back. That's what makes him better than me. They stood in silence, man dying and boy learning to live, both carrying losses that wouldn't heal, but might transform into something useful. The oxygen tank hissed its countdown between them, marking time neither had enough of. Sunday afternoon, Michael pulled up an expensive sedan that looked wrong on Sullivan's street, corporate success visiting working-class roots. He sat in the car for 5 minutes before getting out, steeling himself for confrontation 15 years overdue. Sullivan waited on the porch, giving Michael space to approach on his own terms. Dylan watched from the window, nervous about meeting the son Gunnar had failed, worried this man would see him as replacement instead of separate person. Michael climbed the porch steps like each one cost him, carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical effort. He looked at Sullivan, really looked, and something in his face cracked, seeing how much the cancer had taken. Jesus, Dad, you look like death. Feel like it too. How long really? Weeks, maybe less. Doctor stopped giving estimates, says my body's shutting down faster than models predict. Michael's jaw worked, fighting emotions he'd locked down for 15 years. And you're spending it on this kid. Yeah. Why? Sullivan met his son's eyes, saw the wound still bleeding underneath professional success and expensive clothes. Because maybe I can get it right with him. Maybe I can be present, teach what matters, not fuck it up with drinking and anger and demons I won't deal with. Doesn't fix what I did to you, but maybe it proves I learned something. You learned after I was gone. Yeah, I did, and I'm sorry for that. Sorry I didn't learn when you needed me to. Sorry I chose bottles and club over being your father. Sorry for all of it. Michael's hands clenched, unclenched. Do you know what it was like watching you love everything more than you loved me, watching Mom cry, hiding in my room when you came home drunk? Yeah, because I was there, just not present. And now you're dying and you're being present for some random kid instead of what? Making amends, apologizing properly, being father for once before it's too late. Michael, Sullivan's voice came gentle, no defense left. Would you want that? Me showing up now, dying, needing your forgiveness to feel better about checking out. Michael opened his mouth, closed. It found no good answer. I don't know, and that's honest. I can work with honest. Can you? Because honest means I don't know if I can forgive you. Honest means I'm angry you are dying before we figured this out. Honest means seeing you give this kid what you never gave me hurts worse than you being absent did. Sullivan nodded, accepting pain he'd earned. All true, all fair. I don't blame you. I don't want your acceptance of my anger. I want... Michael's voice broke. I wanted a father. Past tense. That ship sailed 20 years ago. Now I don't know what I want. Fair. They stood in silence, father and son connected by blood and separated by decades of failure. The door opened. Dylan stepped out, small and uncertain, looking between them. Are you Michael? Michael turned, saw Dylan, something complex moving across his face. Jealousy mixed with recognition, mixed with something that might have been compassion. Yeah, are you Dylan? Yeah. You're the one who saved Sophie Hayes. I just did SEEP. That's more than most people could do, especially homeless and scared. Dylan looked at Sullivan, checking if this was trap. Sullivan gave him the small nod. Michael was complicated but not cruel. Gunnar taught me it's okay to be scared if you still try. Michael's eyes cut to Sullivan. He taught you that? Yeah, said he froze once and carried it forever. Said not freezing was the bravest thing. Michael's face worked through emotions. He looked at Sullivan. You told him about Vietnam. Some. Enough. You never told me about Vietnam. Said it was done, wasn't my business. Because I was different father to you. Worse father. Closed off father who thought not talking about pain meant it didn't exist. And now you talk about it. Now I'm dying, changes perspective, makes hiding feel wasteful. Michael turned back to Dylan, studied him. You know he's gonna die soon. Yeah. And you're okay with that? Dylan's voice came small but certain. No, but Gunnar says losing someone who cared is better than never having someone care. I think he's right. Michael's face twisted, something breaking underneath the professional mask. He told you that? Yeah. He never, Michael stopped, breathed. He never said things like that to me. Dylan looked uncomfortable being between father and son. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your fault my father learned how to be present after I left. Sullivan spoke quietly. Michael, I can't fix the past. Can't give you the father you deserved. But if there's anything you learned from not having me there, anything that might help Dylan handle losing me, that's worth something. Michael stared at Sullivan, decades of anger warring with present reality. Finally, he turned back to Dylan. You want to know what it's like having him as a father? Dylan nodded. It's like having Ghost, someone there but not there, someone who loves you but doesn't know how to show it, someone who means well but hurts you anyway. Dylan processed that. He's not a ghost to me. No, because he's dying. That makes him present because he has to be. I got him when he thought he had forever. That's not fair to you. Michael's eyes went wet. No, it's not. But you're not responsible for that. You're just a kid who needs someone. He's trying to be that someone before he runs out of time. That's voice cracking. That's more than he gave me, and I hate that. And I also don't want you to suffer because of what I didn't get. Dylan moved closer, looked up at Michael with eyes too old for 10. I'm sorry he hurt you. Michael laughed, broken sound. You're apologizing for him. No, just sorry you're hurting. I know what that's like. Something in Michael's face changed. He knelt down, brought himself to Dylan's level. Yeah, you do. Your mom died when you were 8. How'd you know? Gunnar mentioned it on the phone, said you learned CPR because you couldn't save her. That true? Yeah. That's a hard thing to carry. Yeah. Michael looked at Dylan, then at Sullivan, then back. Okay. Okay, what? Sullivan asked. Okay, I'll help. Not for you, for him. He doesn't deserve to lose another person who cares just because the system can't see past paperwork. Sullivan's chest clenched. Michael, don't thank me, and don't think this fixes us. This is me being better than you taught me to be. Fair, Sullivan nodded. What do you need me to do? Michael asked. Testify. About what kind of father I was to you. Truth, no sugarcoating. Then maybe talk about why you think Dylan still deserves chance with me despite that. That's asking a lot. Yeah, it is. Michael stood, looked between Sullivan and Dylan, made some internal calculation. I'll do it, but afterward, after the hearing, whatever happens, you and I are going to talk. Really talk, about all of it, while you still can. Deal. Michael turned to leave, stopped at his car, looked back. Dylan, Isham. Yeah, he's going to die soon, probably before you're ready, and it's going to hurt worse than you expect. But having him now is better than not having him at all. Remember that when it gets hard. Dylan nodded, something in his face settling. Thanks. Michael drove away, leaving Sullivan and Dylan on the porch with evening air cold enough to promise winter. Sullivan coughed, fought through it, tasted blood he didn't mention. He hates me. Yeah, but he came anyway. That means something. Means love's complicated. Means you can hate someone and still not want them to fail. Means family doesn't end just because it's hard. Dylan looked at Sullivan with new understanding. Is that what we are, family? Sullivan put his hand on Dylan's shoulder, felt bones too prominent. Yeah, kid, that's what we are. Monday morning arrived, cold and decisive, winter's first real teeth showing. Sullivan woke at 4, couldn't get back to sleep, sat at the kitchen table with coffee and medication that was losing its battle against cancer. Dylan appeared at 5, couldn't sleep either, sat across from Sullivan in silence that needed no words. They drove to the courthouse, at 8, Jackson meeting them in the parking lot with Sophie. 23 motorcycles followed Hell's Angels, making their presence known, without intimidation, just brotherhood showing up. Carlos Mendez waited by the entrance lawyer, in his element, sharp suit, and sharper mind, ready for battle. The courtroom felt smaller than important spaces should wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights turning everything harsh. Sullivan wheeled his oxygen tank down the aisle, each breath harder than yesterday, body accelerating toward nothing. Dylan walked beside him, construction paper medal pinned to his shirt, visible reminder of who he was beneath fear. Judge Margaret Hartley entered, 58, former Marine face that had seen enough to stop being impressed by theater. She looked at the packed courtroom, saw Hell's Angels filling benches, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Rachel Bennett sat at the county's table, professional armor fully deployed, ready to protect Dylan by removing him from everything he'd found. Her face showed conflict she couldn't quite hide, protocol warring with recognition that sometimes rules broke people they meant to protect. Carlos stood open with precision. Your Honor, Dylan Carter is 10-year-old boy who saved 7-year-old Sophie Hayes from cardiac arrest through perfect CPR administration. He's been failed by foster system 3 times, survived 6 months on streets, and found family with Thomas Sullivan and Jackson Hayes. The county wants to remove him from first stable environment he's had in 2 years, based purely on paperwork concerns. We're here to prove family means more than forms. James Foster, county attorney, stood with his own rehearsed opening about high-risk placements and proper procedures. Judge Hartley listened to both face unreadable, gestured for county to proceed. Rachel took the stand. Her testimony came practiced. Professional, devastating. Dylan Carter is high-risk minor in high-risk environment. Primary caregiver Thomas Sullivan is 68-year-old Vietnam veteran with PTSD diagnosis. History of violence and substance abuse documented in arrests spanning 1974 to 1988. Estranged from his own son for 15 years and dying of stage 4 cancer with weeks to live. Secondary support: Jackson Hayes has criminal record including assault and public intoxication, is vice president of motorcycle club with documented criminal activities. This is textbook dangerous placement. Carlos cross-examined with surgical precision. Ms. Bennett, Dylan performed CPR that saved a life while homeless. Does your textbook have protocol for that? That's not relevant to. Does your system have checkbox for child who saves life instead of needing saving? Rachel's jaw tightened. No. Maybe that's the problem. Dylan doesn't fit your boxes. You're trying to protect him by removing him from people who actually see him. How is that protection? Mr. Sullivan is dying in weeks. Forming attachment to father figure who'll die is cruel. More cruel than sending Dylan back to foster homes where he was neglected, and hit more cruel than streets where he slept in condemned buildings. Rachel had no good answer. Judge Hartley watched the exchange, face still unreadable. Defense witnesses came next. Mrs. Patricia Wilson, the CPR instructor, testified about Dylan's dedication, his questions, his promise to be ready. Tommy Briggs from the bike shop spoke about community rallying around the kid. Dr. Kim confirmed Sophie would have died without Dylan's intervention. Then Michael Sullivan took the stand. The courtroom stirred. Even Rachel looked surprised. Carlos approached with careful steps. State your name and relationship to Thomas Sullivan. Michael Sullivan, I'm his son. When did you last see your father before this week? 15 years ago. Why so long? Because he was terrible father, alcoholic with violent temper and emotional unavailability. When I was 18, I cut contact because staying hurt more than leaving. Murmurs rippled through observers. This seemed bad for defense. Carlos pressed forward. Why are you here today? Because 3 days ago, my father called for first time in 15 years. You know what he asked? Tell us. He asked me to help Dylan, not let's reconcile, not I'm dying, let's make peace. He asked me to help a child he'd known less than a week. Michael's voice carried weight that came from places deeper than law. My father failed me completely. I grew up with Ghost instead of Dad. I suffered because he couldn't or wouldn't be present. That's truth. But, he looked at Sullivan, Dylan's getting something I never got. He's getting father who's present, who teaches, who shows up. It came 15 years too late for me, but it's not too late for Dylan. And if my terrible father can learn to be better before he dies, maybe that's worth something. Foster cross-examined. Mr. Sullivan, isn't it possible your father is using Dylan to assuage guilt about failing you? Yes. And that's healthy for Dylan. Healthier than streets, healthier than foster care that failed him 3 times. My father's motivation doesn't change the fact that Dylan's thriving under his care. And when he dies, Dylan will have Jackson Hayes. He'll have me. He'll have 23 men who showed up today because they consider him family. That's more than the system's offering. Michael stepped down into my... Sullivan met his son's eyes, tried to communicate gratitude words couldn't hold. Michael's face stayed hard, but something in it had shifted. Jackson testified next, speaking about Dylan's transformation, about Sophie's gratitude, about commitment to permanent guardianship after Sullivan died. Foster tried to make Jackson's record into disqualification. Carlos turned it into proof that people changed, grew, became more than their worst moments. Then Sullivan took the stand. He refused the wheelchair, gripped the witness box with hands that shook from effort and cancer and 68 years of carrying weight he'd never learned to put down. The oxygen tank hissed beside him, mechanical reminder of time running out. Carlos's voice came gentle. "Thomas, tell the court about Vietnam." Sullivan's chest tightened, not from cancer, but from memories that never really left. March 1971, Mekong Delta. My best friend Marcus Chen took enemy fire. I froze. 3 seconds where my body wouldn't move, wouldn't respond, just locked up from fear. Another Marine dragged Marcus to cover. He died anyway. What does that have to do with Dylan? Dylan didn't freeze. 7-year-old collapses. 10-year-old homeless kid doesn't run, doesn't hide. He acts. Does perfect CPR while 220-pound man charges at him ready to fight. That takes courage I didn't have at 19 with rifle and squad backing me up. Why do you want guardianship? Sullivan looked at Dylan sitting small beside Jackson, construction paper metal pinned to his shirt, eyes wide with fear about things he couldn't control. Because I failed my son. I was there, but I wasn't present. Drank too much, carried too much, couldn't love right. Michael deserved better. He got me instead. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. I can't fix that. Can't give Michael the father he deserved. But Dylan, maybe I can teach him what I learned too late. That courage means acting when you're scared. That showing up matters even when it's hard. That failing doesn't mean you stop trying. Foster stood for cross-examination, voice carrying prosecutorial edge. Mr. Sullivan, you're dying. Yes. Doctor's prognosis is weeks, not months. Correct. So you're asking this court to give Dylan a father figure who'll abandon him through death within a month. Sullivan met Foster's eyes, no flinching. Yes, that's what I'm asking. How is that fair to Dylan? It's not. But Dylan knows unfair. He knows about losing people who matter. What he doesn't know is having someone fight for him while they're here. I've got maybe a month. I'll spend it teaching that kid he matters. Teaching him courage isn't not being scared, it's acting anyway. Teaching him family doesn't end when it's hard. That's more than he's had in 2 years. And when you die, when Dylan loses another person who promised to stay. Sullivan's hands grip the witness box harder. Then Jackson takes over. Then Michael steps up. Then 23 brothers make sure he knows he wasn't alone just because I died. Dylan will hurt when I'm gone. That's unavoidable. But better to hurt from losing someone who cared than never having anyone care at all. Foster had no response to that. Sullivan sat down exhausted, coughing into his hand, coming away with blood he didn't hide anymore. The courtroom saw him dying in real-time countdown, accelerating towards 0. Sophie Hayes walked to the judge's bench, next 7 years old, with drawing clutched in small hands. Judge Hartley leaned down, voice softening. Hello, Sophie. Hi, I made this for you. She unfolded construction papers showing Dylan performing CPR, Gunnar watching from background, all rendered in crayon honesty. Words spelled out in careful letters, my heroes, don't take them away. These are your heroes. Dylan saved me when my heart stopped. Gunnar's teaching him how to be brave. He's helping my daddy be better. If you take them away, we all get hurt. What do you mean Gunnar's helping your daddy be better? Sophie's voice carried 7-year-old wisdom. Daddy used to not see invisible people. Now he does, because Gunnar said we have to. Judge Hartley studied the drawing, saw something in crayon lines that legal arguments couldn't convey. She looked at Dylan. Dylan, do you want to testify? Dylan stood, walked to the stand with legs that barely held him. He placed one hand on the Bible, swore to tell truth he'd lived too much of. Carlos approached gently. Dylan, do you want to live with Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Hayes? Gunnar's dying. I know. So if I say yes, I lose him soon. That's true. Does that change your answer? Dylan looked at Sullivan dying in the gallery, at Michael watching with complicated grief, at Jackson ready to fight, at Sophie holding her drawing. If I say no, I lose him now. Lose Jackson, lose Sophie, lose all the brothers. I go back to being invisible. His voice steadied, finding certainty. My mom died when I was 8. I watched her die and couldn't help. Gunnar watched his friend die and couldn't help. We're broken the same way. He sees me because he knows what it's like when the world hurts and you can't fix it. And you think living with broken people is good for you. I think broken people see other broken people. Maybe that's what I need. Someone who understands scared but tries anyway. That's worth losing him later. Judge Hartley leaned forward. Dylan, Mr. Sullivan will die, probably before you're ready, and that will hurt. I know. Are you choosing this anyway? Yes. Why? Dylan looked at Sullivan, this dying man who'd found him in library, who'd shared sandwiches in silence, who'd promised to fight till he couldn't. Because having someone for a month is better than being alone forever. Because he taught me it's okay to be scared if you still try. Because of voice breaking. Because he sees me. Nobody's seen me in 2 years. I'd rather have him for a month and hurt after than go back to invisible. The courtroom went silent. Judge Hartley looked at Rachel, saw conflict warring in the caseworker's face, turned back to gathered evidence and testimonies, and one small boy asking for family that didn't fit protocols. This is highly irregular case. Dying man wants to mentor child. Motorcycle club wants to adopt. Single father with record wants guardianship. By every protocol, I should deny this request. She paused, let weight settle. But protocol doesn't account for 10-year-old performing perfect CPR. Protocol doesn't account for courage. And protocol especially doesn't account for dying man spending his last weeks fighting for child who isn't his. She looked at Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, you'll likely die before 6-month review hearing. Yes, Your Honor. So guardianship transfers fully to Jackson Hayes upon your death. That's the arrangement. Mr. Hayes, you understand you're accepting responsibility, not just for Dylan, but for completing what Mr. Sullivan begins. Jackson stood. Yes, Your Honor. And Dylan, you understand Mr. Sullivan will die, and that will hurt. Yes. You're choosing this anyway. Yes. Judge Hartley picked up her gavel, held it suspended, looked at Rachel. Ms. Bennett, I'm granting temporary guardianship to Thomas Sullivan and Jackson Hayes joint custody pending permanent adoption proceedings. You'll monitor this placement weekly until Mr. Sullivan's death, then reassess guardianship structure. She brought the gavel down. If this fails, you were right. If it succeeds, maybe we all learn something about families that don't fit forms. Court adjourned. The crack of wood on wood echoed like gunfire. Dylan ran to Sullivan, collided with wheelchair in desperate embrace. Sullivan held him, crying for first time since Doc died, breaking open in ways he'd locked shut for 53 years. Michael watched from the gallery, complicated emotions playing across his face. Jackson stood in respect. 23 Hells Angels rose as one, not celebrating, just witnessing brotherhood, doing what brotherhood did, showing up when it mattered. Rachel approached slowly, face showing something that might have been relief or regret or both. Mr. Sullivan, Dylan, I'll be monitoring weekly. If anything concerns me, we'll be here. Sullivan's voice came hoarse. Every week, whatever you need. Rachel looked at Dylan, really saw what protocol had missed. I hope I'm wrong about my concerns, for his sake. She left with clipboard and doubt system, walking away with some humanity restored. The courtroom emptied slowly, people filtering into November cold case concluded. But story just beginning. Outside on courthouse steps, Sullivan breathed hard, body reminding him that fighting for life cost what little he had left. Dylan stood beside him, close enough to catch if he fell. Michael approached. Stopped 3 feet away, careful distance. Dad, yeah. After this, after you rest, we should talk. Really talk. While there's still time. Sullivan nodded. I'd like that. Don't make me regret helping today. I'll try not to. Michael walked to his car, didn't look back, but something in his shoulders had released tension he had carried 15 years. Sullivan watched him go, felt something like hope that maybe broken things could partially mend before they shattered completely. Jackson pulled his truck around, helped Sullivan into passenger seat. Dylan climbed in back with Sophie, 4 people heading home, family confirmed by judge, but built through crisis, bound by choices that looked crazy on paper but felt right in lived experience. Ice cream, Sullivan said suddenly. Jackson glanced over. You sure you look like you need hospital more than Dairy Queen? I'm dying anyway. Might as well die eating Rocky Road. Dylan leaned forward from back seat. You're too sick. Kid, I'm dying. Least I can do is buy you celebration ice cream. So they went to Dairy Queen, 4 people, in an oxygen tank, ordered sundaes they ate in November sunshine that felt borrowed time stolen from inevitable countdown. Sophie chattered about school. Dylan ate in careful bites, making it last. Jackson and Sullivan sat in companionable silence, brothers who'd ridden together 12 years now, riding toward ending they could see approaching. Sullivan coughed up blood into his napkin, hid it before Dylan noticed, knew he was hiding nothing. His body was giving up by degrees cancer, winning race against his will to finish what he'd started. Weeks, the doctor said. Maybe weeks, maybe less. He looked at Dylan, licking chocolate from his spoon at Sophie, showing him the right way to eat whipped cream at Jackson, watching both kids with relief that came from nearly losing one and gaining another. This was family. Messy, complicated, built on crisis and CPR and dying men making promises they might not live to keep. Good enough, it would have to be. They drove home as afternoon turned to evening, 4 generations in one truck if you counted Sullivan's age. November cold pressed against windows, promising winter that Sullivan wouldn't see. But today was one. The judge had ruled family trumped protocol. Dylan was theirs, at least for whatever time Sullivan had left, to teach him courage looked like acting scared. The house welcomed them back with warmth and oxygen tanks and medication bottles lined up like soldiers. Sullivan's calendar hung on the wall, November mostly blank, except for today's notation. Court, win or lose, we tried. He'd write tomorrow, won. Now teach him everything before time's up. Weeks to do what should take years. Weeks to compress lifetime of lessons into moments that might stick. Weeks to prove that dying could create something instead of just destroying. Sullivan looked at Dylan, helping Sophie with her jacket at Jackson, checking his phone for messages, at the life that had materialized in his house where death had been camping out. Not redemption exactly. Redemption implied making past right. But maybe this was better, making present matter before future arrived to erase it all. The oxygen tank hissed. The calendar waited. Weeks remained, or days, or however long bodies lasted, when they decided quitting was easier than continuing. Sullivan would make them count. The first week built itself from small rituals, neither planned but both needed. Dylan woke before dawn, started coffee the way Sullivan had shown him, 3 scoops strong enough to fight back. Sullivan emerged from his bedroom later each morning, body requiring more negotiation to move portable oxygen, his constant companion now instead of occasional necessity. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, words unnecessary when presence said enough. The garage became their cathedral. Sullivan kept his 1972 Harley there, chrome still gleaming, despite years of neglect, engine that hadn't turned over in months. He'd stopped riding when cancer made balance impossible, but the motorcycle remained testament to different life, reminder of who he'd been before dying became full-time work. Dylan learned to change oil with hands that smelled like grease and purpose. Sullivan talked while working, sentences coming in fragments between breaths that got harder. Engines like a heart. Pistons pump valves, breathe oil flows. Take care of it, takes care of you. Dylan positioned the wrench Sullivan indicated, turned it with effort that showed in his thin arms. Like CPR. Exactly like CPR. Everything's about keeping things alive, long as you can. The lessons came wrapped in motorcycle maintenance, responsibility, care, attention to detail. Understanding that neglect showed up eventually, no matter how well you hid it. Sullivan taught by doing, letting Dylan's hands learn what words couldn't convey, building competence that would outlast them both. School started the following Monday. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, who'd bent rules to enroll Dylan, checked on him daily those first weeks. 6th grade meant new teachers established social hierarchies Dylan had to navigate, being visible after 2 years of practiced invisibility. Sophie helped introducing him to classmates with authority that came from being the girl whose life he'd saved. Dylan's desk held textbooks and pencils and normalcy that felt foreign. Teachers noticed the kid was sharp, especially in math and science brain, that had spent months surviving, now allowed to learn instead. He asked questions that showed he'd been thinking long before school gave him permission to. Sophie's construction, paper metal, stayed pinned inside his locker where he could see it, but others couldn't, private reminder of worth, when classmates whispered about the homeless kid living with dying biker. Dylan heard the whispers, ignored them with practice born from being invisible. Words couldn't hurt worse than hunger or cold, or sleeping in condemned buildings. School was easy by comparison. Jackson picked him up most afternoons, drove him to Sullivan's house where homework happened at the kitchen table while Sullivan rested. They developed routine. Dylan worked through assignments. Sullivan dozed in his chair, the steady rhythm of compressed air marking time neither discussed. Evenings meant dinner together, three of them, when Sophie joined just Dylan and Sullivan when she stayed home. They cooked simple meals Dylan was learning to prepare alone, knowing the day would come when Sullivan couldn't help anymore. Spaghetti chili, roasted chicken meals that stretched and reheated, practical food for practical lives. After dinner came garage time, working on the motorcycle with purpose, Sullivan made clear without stating directly. This bike would be Dylan's someday. Learning to maintain it meant earning it, understanding the responsibility of caring for something beyond yourself, accepting legacy that came with weight. Sullivan didn't say, "This will be yours when I'm gone." Didn't need to. Dylan understood the way you understand approaching winter, inevitable, unspoken, requiring preparation that wouldn't prevent it, but might make survival possible. The Hells Angels brothers visited in rotating shifts, never asking if Sullivan needed help, but showing up with groceries, offering rides, checking that the house stayed warm, and the bills got paid. Reaper came Tuesdays, usually brought dinner. Tiny stopped by Thursdays with supplies. Snake handled weekend runs to the pharmacy. Brotherhood looked like showing up without being asked, staying without being thanked, accepting that dying men needed dignity more than pity. Dylan watched how brothers treated Sullivan respectfully, carefully, but never diminishing him to his illness. They talked about club business, asked his opinion on decisions they could have made without him, maintained fiction that he still mattered to operations he'd left behind. Dylan learned something about dying with grace, about letting people help without losing yourself to helplessness. Michael Sullivan came on Saturdays now. The first visit after court had been awkward. 47-year-old lawyer trying to figure out how to be son again after 15 years of being orphaned by choice. He brought coffee from expensive shop, sat at Sullivan's kitchen table, looked at his dying father with emotions he couldn't untangle. Dylan gave them space, sensing this was private thing between father and son. But Sullivan called him back, insisted Dylan stay. Whatever came next involved all of them, not just fragments trying to reconnect. Sullivan's voice came weaker each week, cancer eating through everything, including his ability to sound strong. "How's work?" "Busy. Closed major merger last week. $80 million deal." "That's good. You always were smart. Got that from your mother." Michael's jaw tightened at the mention of his mother, divorced, 35 years, but still tender subject. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying, which I am, so seems appropriate." The dark humor landed flat. Michael didn't know how to laugh about death, especially death he'd imagined wanting for 15 years, then discovered he didn't want at all when it actually arrived. Dylan watched them carefully, seeing two people who loved each other, but didn't know the language anymore, connection corroded by absence. Neither knew how to repair quickly enough to matter. "Can I ask you something?" Dylan's voice cut through awkward silence. Michael turned to him, grateful for the interruption. "Sure. What was he like before Vietnam, before drinking, before everything went bad?" Michael considered the question, searched memory for father that existed before the damaged version. "He was funny, told terrible jokes, worked on motorcycles in the garage, same as now, came to my baseball games when I was little, cheated at board games and didn't care who knew. He was voice-catching. He was present until he wasn't." "What changed?" Michael looked at Sullivan, decided honesty served better than protection. "Vietnam changed him. He came back different. Then mom left and he got worse. Started drinking, started choosing club over family, started being ghost in the house instead of father in the world. I was 12 when I stopped recognizing him, 18 when I gave up trying." Sullivan sat with that assessment, no defense offered, no excuses made. Just acceptance of damage, cataloged accurately. "I'm sorry." His words came simple, inadequate, true. "I failed you completely." "Yeah, you did." They sat in silence that held decades of that failure weight pressing down like gravity, deciding which direction things fell. Dylan looked between them, saw his own future, what happened when people you loved died before making things right, how that wound stayed open even when you tried closing it. "But you didn't fail Dylan." Michael's voice carried complexity Dylan couldn't fully parse. "That counts for something. Does it? Does failing you but succeeding with him balance anything?" No, but it means you learn that you're capable of being what I needed just 20 years late. He stopped, breathed. That's something. The conversation moved to safer territory after that. Dylan's school progress, motorcycle maintenance, logistics of what happened after Sullivan died. Michael had contacted family law attorney about permanent adoption, started paperwork that would make Jackson Dylan's legal guardian when the time came. Practical concerns that skirted emotion, letting them talk without bleeding all over the kitchen table. But the fourth Saturday, Michael brought someone, his wife, Catherine, 45, and kind-faced mother of Michael's two teenagers who hadn't come today. She'd heard about Dylan, about Sullivan's situation, wanted to meet the boy who'd somehow started healing wounds she'd watched Michael carry 15 years. Dylan tensed when strangers entered, old instincts activating. Catherine read that, immediately moved slowly, gave him space to decide she wasn't threat. Dylan, I've heard a lot about you, about how brave you are. Dylan shrugged, uncomfortable with praise that followed him everywhere now. Just did what I learned. Michael says you saved a little girl's life. That's more than just learned behavior. That's character. She turned to Sullivan, extended her hand. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Catherine, Michael's wife. Sullivan shook her hand, grip weaker than he wanted, strength leaving in increments he couldn't stop. Call me Gunner. Everyone does. Gunner, then. Thank you for giving Michael reason to reconnect. He's been carrying a lot of pain. Having purpose in helping you and Dylan, it started healing things I couldn't reach. Sullivan nodded, understood what she wasn't saying directly. Michael had needed this, needed dying father and surrogate son to create space where reconciliation could happen without being named. Sometimes healing came sideways through helping others instead of fixing yourself directly. Catherine asked Dylan about school homework, whether he liked living here. Her questions felt genuine rather than investigative, mothering impulse that wanted to ensure the child was okay because children mattering came naturally to her. Dylan answered carefully, still not trusting that kindness didn't come with cost. But when she asked about the motorcycle, his defenses dropped slightly. He walked her to the garage, showed her the 1972 Harley with pride that belonged to someone who'd helped restore it. Pointed out work they'd done, explained why oil viscosity mattered. Catherine listened like it mattered, asked questions that showed she cared about his caring, saw past the information to the boy building identity through mechanical work. Michael and Sullivan watched from the kitchen doorway, father and son, observing Dylan connect with mother, figure neither of them had given him. She's good with him. Sullivan's observation came quiet. She's good with everyone. It's infuriating sometimes. You love her. Yeah, she saved me after I left, gave me reason to be someone instead of just someone's disappointing son. Sullivan flinched at that earned criticism landing clean. Does it help seeing me with Dylan, or does it make everything worse? Michael thought about that, wrestling with honesty. Both. I see you being father you never were with me. That hurts. But I also see you trying, really trying to do right before you can't anymore. He stopped. That makes me think maybe you did love me. You just didn't know how to show it. I did love you. I do love you. I was just too broken to make that matter. You're still broken. Yeah, but now I'm broken and trying. Dylan gives me reason to try. Michael's eyes filled but didn't spill. I wish I'd been enough reason. Sullivan turned to face his son, fully looked at him with dying man's clarity that cut through everything inessential. You were always enough. The problem was never you. It was me, broken in ways that had nothing to do with you but hurt you anyway. I'm sorry for that. For all of it. I know you are. That doesn't fix it. No, but maybe it start. Catherine and Dylan returned from the garage, Dylan animated in ways Sullivan rarely saw, talking about engine compression and timing chains with someone who asked good questions. Michael watched them, saw his wife mothering the boy. His father was learning to father complicated geometry of family forming from broken pieces that didn't quite fit but held together anyway. They stayed for lunch, simple meal of sandwiches and chips, conversation that flowed easier with Catherine mediating between men who loved each other but communicated in fragments. She asked Sullivan about Vietnam, about his Hells Angels years, about life before dying became primary occupation. He answered more honestly than he'd ever answered Michael, maybe because having nothing to lose meant nothing to hide. Dylan absorbed every word, learning Sullivan's history, understanding the full man instead of just the dying shell. The stories revealed complexity, good choices mixed with terrible ones, courage alongside cowardice, loyalty, twisted into excuse for staying broken. Sullivan didn't paint himself as hero or villain, just human trying and failing, and sometimes succeeding at being decent. When they left, Michael lingered at the door. "Dad, I'll come next Saturday. We should keep talking while we can." "I'd like that. Don't die before then." "I'll try not to." Michael almost smiled gone before it fully formed. Catherine hugged Dylan goodbye, maternal gesture he didn't know how to return, but didn't pull away from either. Their car disappeared down the street, leaving Sullivan and Dylan alone with afternoon light that felt different, somehow warmer, maybe less like ending, and more like acknowledging what existed before it couldn't. Thanksgiving arrived, cold and determined winter, showing its teeth. Sullivan woke that morning unable to get out of bed without help, body staging protest against continuing. Dylan found him struggling, called Jackson, who arrived with practiced efficiency, born from knowing this day was coming. They moved Sullivan to the hospice bed that had materialized in the living room sometime last week, medical supply company delivering it with sympathy nobody wanted. The bed put Sullivan in center of house, instead of hidden in bedroom, acknowledgement that dying deserved witnessing, that end of life wasn't shame requiring concealment. Jackson had invited everyone, Hell's Angels brothers, Michael and Catherine, Sophie, Mrs. Wilson from the shelter, Tommy Briggs, Victor Castellano, even Rachel Bennett, who'd surprise everyone by accepting. 25 people in Sullivan's small house community that had formed around one dying man's determination to do right by one homeless kid. The kitchen overflowed with food. People brought turkey stuffing, cranberry sauce pies that covered every surface. Traditional Thanksgiving meal prepared by people who understood gratitude came in forms beyond turkey. They were grateful for Sullivan for what he'd taught about showing up, about brotherhood, meaning action, instead of words, about dying with purpose, instead of just dying. Sullivan couldn't sit at the table. The morphine kept pain manageable, but also kept him floating, consciousness drifting in and out like radio signal that couldn't hold frequency. Dylan stayed beside the hospice bed, close enough to hear if Sullivan spoke, present even when presence meant sitting in silence. Reaper led Grace Hell's Angels, Sergeant-at-Arms, taking a role he'd never imagined wanting. Not much for religion, but we're grateful today. For this food, this family, this moment. And for Gunnar, who taught us brotherhood means showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He looked at Sullivan, face showing emotion the patch usually hid. "Brother, you're fighting your last battle, and you're winning, because look at this," gesture encompassing crowded room. "This is your legacy, not the fights, not the mistakes, this." Sullivan's eyes opened, focused with difficulty, found Reaper across the room. His hand moved slightly, acknowledgement without words, gratitude expressed through trembling fingers that still remembered how to salute. The meal happened in shifts, people rotating through kitchen and living room, making sure everyone ate while maintaining presence near Sullivan. Dylan stayed anchored beside the bed, refusing to leave, needing Sullivan to know he wasn't alone, even when unconscious. Sophie brought Dylan a plate, sat on the floor beside his chair. "Is Gunnar gonna die today?" Dylan looked at her 7-year-old, asking question adults avoided. "I don't know. Maybe. I don't want him to." "Me either." "But he's ready, right? He taught you everything." Dylan considered that, lessons compressed into weeks instead of years. "No, but maybe that's okay. Maybe you can't teach everything, just enough." Sophie nodded like that made sense, ate mashed potatoes with complete focus of childhood that could hold tragedy and normalcy simultaneously without breaking. Sullivan's stirred voice barely audible, even with Dylan leaning close. His words came fragmented, morphine and cancer, making sentences difficult. 53 years. Carried Doc's death. Dylan gripped his hand. "I'm here. You are okay." 47 years. Carried Michael's childhood. "Michael's here too. He came. Everyone came." Sullivan's eyes focused slightly, found Dylan's face. "But Dylan did right by Dylan. Maybe that's enough." "It's enough. You did good. One kid, loved right, before I go." His eyes found Michael standing in the doorway, listening, tears running unchecked. "Michael, I'm sorry. For all of it." Michael crossed the room, knelt beside the bed, took his father's other hand. "I know, Dad. Can you forgive me?" Michael's face twisted, decades of anger, warring with present reality, a father dying in hospice bed, trying even now to make amends. "I'm working on it. But Dad, I love you. Despite everything, I love you." Sullivan's eyes closed, something releasing in his face. That's enough. More than enough. He slept then in morphine, pulling him under, breathing shallow but steady. Michael stayed kneeling, holding his father's hand, crying in a way he probably hadn't since childhood. Catherine came to him, placed her hand on his shoulder, gave him permission to break completely. Dylan watched them, saw father and son finding peace that came late, but still came reconciliation that wouldn't erase damage, but acknowledged it while choosing connection anyway. He understood that grief could coexist with love, that you could mourn someone who hurt you. That complicated was okay because clean endings only happened in fiction. Rachel Bennett stood near the doorway, observing the scene with professional detachment that was cracking around the edges. She'd spent 11 years learning protocols, believing systems protected children better than messy human connection. But watching this dying man surrounded by people who chose to show up child thriving, despite every risk factor her training said should destroy him, something in her certainty fractured. The afternoon faded into evening. People left in groups, saying goodbye to Sullivan, whether he heard or not, thanking him for lessons in brotherhood they hadn't known they needed. The house emptied slowly until only core remained. Dylan Jackson, Michael, Catherine, Sophie, Rachel, lingering by the door, and Reaper staying because someone needed to witness. December 10th arrived 7 days after Thanksgiving, winter settling in with purpose. Rachel Bennett pulled up to Sullivan's house for her weekly check-in, clipboard in hand, noting that her next visit would likely be the last. Sullivan's condition had deteriorated past the point where monitoring placement made sense. Soon she'd be filing final report recommending permanent guardianship transfer to Jackson Hayes, closing a case that had challenged every assumption she held about proper protocol. She knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Dylan's voice came from inside, high and panicked. "Help! I need help!" Rachel's training kicked in. She tried the door, unlocked, burst through into living room chaos. Sullivan lay half-conscious on the floor beside the hospice bed, Dylan kneeling over him, checking pulse with shaking hands. Pill bottles scattered across the floor, morphine pump displaying error message, Sullivan's breathing shallow and irregular. "What happened?" Rachel dropped to her knees beside Dylan. "I don't know. I was doing homework and I heard crash. He fell. He's not responding right. The breathing's wrong." Rachel assessed quickly. Sullivan's pupils were pinpoint breathing, depressed skin, cold and clammy. Her mind cataloged possibilities: morphine overdose, intentional or accidental. The pump malfunction could have delivered full reservoir. Or Sullivan could have taken extra pills, choosing his own exit. Either way, this was exactly the kind of crisis that proved her right. Dying man couldn't safely care for child. This was documentation for removal. This was vindication of every concern she'd raised. But Dylan wasn't falling apart. His hands moved with purpose, positioning Sullivan's head to open airway, checking vitals the way someone trained would check them. His voice stayed level despite the fear underneath. Heart rate slow, maybe 50 beats per minute. Breathing's 8 per minute. Pupils aren't reacting. I think it's opioid overdose. Rachel stared at him. 10-year-old kid diagnosing overdose with accuracy that matched her own assessment. "How do you know that?" "Mrs. Wilson taught us at the shelter. She said street people need to know overdose signs because we might be the only ones there to help." Dylan looked at Rachel with desperate clarity. "We need Narcan. Reverse the opioids. Do you have any?" Rachel did standard issue in her emergency kit after the state mandated all field workers carry it. She retrieved the nasal spray, handed it to Dylan. "You know how to use this?" "Yeah, 1 spray each nostril. Wait 2 minutes. Give second dose if no response." His hands didn't shake as he administered it. Practice movements, muscle memory from training Rachel hadn't known existed. He positioned Sullivan in recovery position, monitored breathing, tracked time on the wall clock with focus that came from understanding minutes mattered. Rachel watched this child function under pressure. That broke adult saw competence she dismissed as lucky instinct during Sophie's cardiac arrest. This wasn't luck. This was trained response knowledge, applied deliberately, courage under fire that came from surviving situations where freezing meant dying. 90 seconds after administration, Sullivan gasped. His breathing deepened, pupils dilating slightly, consciousness returning in fragments. He coughed, tried to speak, couldn't form words yet, but was present in ways he hadn't been minutes ago. Dylan monitored him, checking vitals every 30 seconds, documenting changes with precision. His fear showed now that crisis was passing, hands starting to shake, breath coming faster. But he didn't stop working, didn't let emotion override function until Sullivan was stable. "We should call ambulance," Rachel's voice came automatically. "No." Dylan's response was immediate. "He doesn't want hospital. He's got days, maybe less. Hospice said comfort care only. Ambulance just makes him die in hospital instead of home." "Dylan, this is serious. He could have died." "He is dying, that's the point. But not today, not like this, not without saying goodbye." Rachel looked between Sullivan and Dylan, saw child making end-of-life care decisions with clarity that came from being present through dying in ways most adults avoided. Her protocols said call 911, document unsafe environment, remove child immediately. But her eyes saw family functioning exactly as family should, messy, terrified but showing up when it mattered most. She made decision that violated every rule she'd followed 11 years. "Okay, no ambulance, but I'm calling hospice nurse, and I'm staying until they get here." Dylan's face showed relief and surprise in equal measure. "You're not taking me away." "No." The word came before Rachel fully processed it, instinct overriding training. "You just saved his life. That's not someone who needs removing. That's someone who needs supporting." She called, hospice explained the situation, got nurse en route. Then she helped Dylan move Sullivan back to bed, adjusted the malfunctioning morphine pump, cleaned up scattered medications. They worked in silence. Two people with very different training, united by singular purpose. Keep this dying man comfortable enough to finish on his terms. Sullivan's consciousness returned gradually. He looked at Dylan, at Rachel, understanding dawning. "What happened?" "Pump malfunction." Dylan's voice stayed steady. "Gave you too much morphine. We fixed it." "We?" "Me and Rachel." Sullivan's eyes found Rachel, question forming. Rachel spoke before he could ask. "I came for weekly check-in. Found Dylan handling medical emergency with competence that most EMTs don't have. Kid saved your life, again. You gonna report this?" "Take him," Rachel looked at Dylan. This child who'd performed CPR on strangers survived streets through sheer determination, now managing end-of-life care with grace most adults couldn't muster. Her training said yes. Her humanity said something different. "No, I'm going to document that family experienced medical crisis and responded appropriately." That child demonstrated capability under pressure. That placement remained stable despite challenging circumstances. She paused, chose next words carefully. "Mr. Sullivan, I was wrong about you, about all of this. I came here 8 weeks ago seeing risks. Now I see family. Unconventional, messy, built on crisis and choice instead of blood and paperwork. But family nonetheless. Dylan's thriving here. That's what matters." Sullivan's hand found Dylan's grip, weak but intentional. "Kid saved me. Third time if we're counting. CPR on Sophie, finding me at library, now this. I learned from the best." Dylan's voice cracked. "You taught me not to freeze. Seems you're better teacher than I am." The hospice nurse arrived, checked Sullivan, thoroughly adjusted medications, gave Rachel a approving nod that suggested she'd made right call, not hospitalizing. They stayed through the evening, making sure Sullivan stabilized, that Dylan knew what to watch for, that systems were in place for the time remaining. Before Rachel left, she pulled Dylan aside. "You did good today. Really good. But Dylan, he's going to die soon. Days, maybe a week. You know that, right?" "Yeah, I know." "And you're ready." Dylan looked at Sullivan, sleeping peacefully. Morphine regulated, now pain managed, time borrowed but still his. "No. But ready doesn't matter. He needs me. That's enough." Rachel nodded, understanding something about courage that protocols couldn't teach. She placed her card on the table, wrote her cell number on back. "Call me. Anytime, day or night. When it happens, you call me first. Before anyone official, give yourselves time." "Why are you helping us?" Rachel looked at this child who'd challenged every assumption she'd built career on, who'd proven that families came in forms her training said were wrong, but her eyes saw working. "Because someone should have helped me learn what you already know, that love matters more than rules. That showing up beats following protocol. That family isn't defined by paperwork." She left with documentation that would close Dylan's case as success, with understanding that sometimes protecting children meant trusting the unconventional families they'd built for themselves. Dylan sat beside Sullivan's bed through the night, monitoring breathing that stayed steady now, watching over the man who'd watched over him. The crisis had passed. Time borrowed remained borrowed. But today wasn't the ending. Stay. The final days collapsed into routine punctuated by Sullivan's increasing absence. He slept more than woke morphine, keeping pain at bay, but also keeping him distant from the world he was leaving. Dylan maintained vigil, doing homework at Sullivan's bedside, reading aloud from books Sullivan could no longer respond to present, even when presence meant just breathing nearby. Michael came daily now, taking leave from work. Nobody questioned when they learned why. He sat with his father, talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, filled silence with voice that said, "I'm here," without needing Sullivan to acknowledge it. Sometimes Catherine joined, sometimes he came alone. Either way, he showed up. 47 years of absence compressed into final days of presence that came late but still came. Jackson brought Sophie every afternoon, letting 7-year-olds say goodbye in increments, teaching her that death was natural even when it hurt. She drew pictures for Sullivan, taped them to the wall where he might see them when consciousness returned. Flowers, rainbows, stick figures labeled "My Family," Dylan and Sophie holding hands, Jackson in the middle. Sullivan watching from above with wings that looked more like motorcycle parts than feathers. Hell's Angels brothers came in shifts, maintaining vigil that looked like guarding, but felt like honoring. They told stories Sullivan couldn't hear, laughed at memories he couldn't share, sat in silence that acknowledged brother leaving them. Reaper stayed most nights sleeping in Sullivan's chair, making sure dying man wasn't alone when darkness came. December 3rd arrived cold and inevitable. Sullivan's breathing had changed overnight pattern. Hospice nurse said meant hours instead of days. The death rattle had started, lungs filling with fluid nobody could drain, countdown entering final phase. Michael and Dylan sat on either side of the bed, each holding a hand, son who'd been abandoned and son who'd been found, both bearing witness to ending they'd known was coming, but still weren't ready for. Jackson stood at the foot of the bed, Sophie cradled in his arms, teaching her what goodbye looked like. Catherine waited near the window, giving family space while staying close enough to support. Reaper held post by the door, guardian to the last. Sullivan's consciousness flickered one final time near dawn. His eyes opened clearer than they'd been in days, found each face around him. His lips moved, trying to form words his body couldn't support anymore. Dylan leaned close. "We're here. Everyone's here." Sullivan's grip tightened fractionally on Dylan's hand, message sent without words. Then his eyes found Michael, held there, something passing between father and son that needed no language. Michael's tears fell freely, unashamed grief and love and forgiveness wrapped together. "I love you, Dad. I forgive you. Rest now." Sullivan's face relaxed, permission granted. His breathing slowed, further gaps between breaths stretching longer. At 4:17 in the morning, one breath came and another didn't follow. His chest settled, face releasing pain that had lived there decades. Empty shell remained, but Sullivan had gone. Dylan made sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite anything, just noise that comes when the bottom falls out. He held Sullivan's hand tighter, as if grip alone could call him back. Michael closed his father's eyes, performing final act of care he wished he'd given for 47 years, but at least could give now. Reaper stepped forward, placed his hand on Sullivan's chest, held it there, moment of silence. Then he saluted, sharp and proper military honor for brother who'd earned it multiple times over. "Ride free, Gunner." The room held that moment, death acknowledged without rushing past it, giving grief space to be felt before moving into logistics that dying required. Dawn light began filtering through windows, December morning, arriving indifferent to loss that felt universe-changing to the people left behind. They sat with the body another hour, letting death be real before calling authorities that would take Sullivan away. This was their time, family time space, to begin processing loss that would take years, not hours. Jackson spoke first, voice gentle. "Rachel said to call her first. Give us time." Dylan nodded, couldn't speak, yet pulled out the card Rachel had left with her cell number. His fingers shook, dialing. She answered on second ring, voice alert despite early hour. "Dylan, he's gone. I'm coming. Don't call anyone else yet. Give me 20 minutes. She arrived in 15, entered, quietly saw family surrounding a body that had been father, brother, mentor, friend. She didn't pull out clipboard, didn't take notes, just stood witness to grief that deserved acknowledging before processing. After appropriate silence, she spoke softly. "I'll handle notifications. Give you another hour before official people come. Use that time however you need. Jackson gripped her shoulder in thanks. Rachel withdrew to kitchen, made necessary calls, gave family privacy to say goodbyes that came too late to matter, but needed saying anyway. Michael broke first, crying without restraint, grieving father he'd had, and father he'd never had, complicated mess of love and anger and regret that death made permanent. Catherine held him, let him shatter, knowing some things required breaking before they could be rebuilt. Dylan stayed quiet, holding Sullivan's hand, not ready to let go of physical connection, even when the person had already left. Sophie climbed down from Jackson's arms, approached the bed with 7-year-old solemnity, placed her drawing on Sullivan's chest. Bye, Gunner. Thank you for teaching Dylan how to be brave. I love you. She climbed back to her father, buried her face in his shoulder, done with goodbye that couldn't be undone. The coroner arrived at 7, removed Sullivan's body with practiced efficiency that felt wrong, shouldn't be routine. Shouldn't be just another Tuesday morning. Collection should acknowledge that this particular body mattered more than paperwork suggested. But death was death routine to everyone except the people left behind. Dylan watched them take Sullivan away, body bag that made everything final closure that didn't close anything. The hospice bed stayed empty. Mechanical ghost of deathbed nobody wanted to look at. The funeral happened December 6th, 3 days after death, gave everyone time to process what couldn't be processed. Hells Angels funerals followed protocol: motorcycles in procession, flag-draped casket, military honors for veterans, brothers, speaking in turns about the man behind the patch. 150 motorcycles showed up, chapters from across state brotherhood, extending beyond the Maple Street chapter Sullivan had called home. They lined the route to the cemetery, engines rumbling respect. Leather and chrome army, seeing brother, off-right. Sullivan's Harley led the procession in the bed of a pickup truck, Dylan riding beside it because 10 was too young to ride alone, but not too young to represent. The flag-draped casket followed Vietnam veteran finally going home to cemetery filled with others who'd served and survived long enough to die later. Veterans Affairs conducted the military portion, 21-gun salute that made Dylan flinch. Taps played on bugle that carried across cold morning flag, folded with precision that turned grief into geometry. An honor guard presented the flag to Michael as next of kin ceremony, acknowledging Sullivan's service 53 years after it had ended. The Hells Angels portion came next, less formal but no less meaningful. Reaper spoke first, voice carrying authority that came from 30 years in the club. Gunner was hard man, didn't sugarcoat, didn't pretend. But when chips were down, he showed up. That's what brotherhood means. Not being perfect, just being present when it matters. Other brothers spoke tiny snake wrench, each sharing stories that revealed Sullivan's full complexity. The bar fights and the loyalty, the drinking and the courage, the failures and the moments of unexpected grace. They painted picture of complete human instead of sanitized version, honored him by being honest. Michael's eulogy came last, lawyer finding words for father he'd lost multiple times before final loss. My father failed me for 30 years. That's fact, not an accusation. He was there but not present, loving but unable to show it, trying but not hard enough. I carried that failure, let it shape me, wondered if I mattered to him at all. His voice steadied, finding certainty. Then in his last month, he taught me what I needed to know. That it's never too late to try. That failing doesn't mean giving up. That being good father to Dylan didn't erase being bad father to me, but showed he'd learned something. That growth matters even when it comes late. He looked at Sullivan's casket, flag draped and final. Dad, I forgive you, not because you earned it, because holding anger while you're gone serves nothing. I forgive you. And I'll teach Dylan what you taught me, that damaged people can still love, broken people can still try, and late is better than never. Dylan stood when Michael finished, small figure moving to the casket with Sophie's drawing in his hands, updated version, showing Dylan and Sullivan working on motorcycle together. He placed it on the flag, gift for the journey. His voice came quiet, but everyone heard. Gunner taught me I matter, taught me it's okay to be scared and try anyway. Taught me family isn't blood, it's who stays. He stayed. Even dying, he stayed. Thank you for that. He stepped back. Sophie taking his hand, both children, understanding, lost adults tried to complicate. Sullivan was gone. That hurt. But he'd been here, and that mattered more. The burial happened with efficiency death demanded. Casket lowered into ground beside other veterans, Sullivan joining the ranks of those who'd served and survived and eventually succumbed. Dylan refused to leave graveside, watching dirt cover casket, needing to see ending complete before he could begin accepting it. Jackson finally pulled him away as sun set, winter dark coming early. "We can come back anytime you want. Promise. Promise." Sophie squeezed Dylan's hand. "I'll come with you, so you're not alone." 3 days after the funeral, Michael arrived at Jackson's house carrying a box. Inside was Sullivan's Hells Angels vest, worn leather that smelled like oil and cigarettes, and decades of being worn by a man who'd lived hard. Dylan looked at it, uncertain. "This was his. I can't. There's something in the pocket." Michael's voice carried weight. Dylan reached into the inside pocket, found an envelope addressed to Michael in Sullivan's shaky handwriting. Michael opened it, read aloud. "Michael, give this to Dylan when he's 18 and patched. Tell him I'm proud. Tell him you're proud too. He earned this more than I ever did. And son, thank you for coming back. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for being a better man than I taught you to be. Keep showing up for Dylan the way I couldn't show up for you. That's how you heal, by breaking the cycle, by being present, by choosing different. I love you. I'm sorry. I'm proud of who you became despite me." "Dad." Michael's voice broke on the last words. He looked at Dylan, this kid who'd somehow started healing wounds, 15 years old. "He wanted you to have this when you were ready." "I'll never be ready. None of us are. But we do it anyway. That's what he taught us." Michael paused. "Dylan, are you worried I'm going to disappear now?" Now that he's gone, the question hung between them, fear Dylan hadn't voiced but carried since Sullivan died. "Yeah, I'm not. He made me promise, and I'm keeping it. Not just because he asked, but because you deserve what I didn't get, someone who stays, someone who shows up, someone who's present even when it's hard." "Why would you do that? I'm not your son." "No, but you're the reason I got my father back before he died. You're the reason Michael and I had those last Saturdays. And maybe," his voice caught, "maybe teaching you helps heal what broke in me." Dylan looked at the vest, too big for him now, but waiting. Legacy that came with responsibility. Brotherhood that demanded showing up, family that chose him back. "What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough?" Michael knelt down, brought himself to Dylan's eye level. "Then you mess up and try again. That's what family does. Gunnar messed up with me for 30 years, but he tried at the end. I messed up by staying away 15 years, but I came back. You'll mess up too. We all do. The question isn't whether you fail, it's whether you keep trying after." Dylan nodded, accepting wisdom that came from experience rather than theory. Michael folded the vest carefully, placed it back in the box. "Keep this safe. When you're 18, when you have earned your patch, you wear this. Until then, you keep learning, keep growing, keep being the person Gunnar saw when he looked at you." What person was that? Someone brave enough to save lives when everyone else was running. Someone strong enough to stay soft in a world that makes you hard. Someone who breaks cycles instead of perpetuating them. That's who you are, Dylan. That's who you'll keep being. 1 year later, December 3rd arrived, cold and sharp. Dylan woke in his room at Jackson's house, permanent now. Adoption finalized in February through Michael's legal work. School photos lined one wall, friends smiling beside him, evidence of life lived instead of just survived. The medals Sophie had made him hung beside photo of Sullivan working on the motorcycle, reminder of where he'd been and who'd helped him get here. 11 years old now, 6th grade, nearly complete, straight A's, because learning mattered when you had future instead of just survival. CPR instructor certificate from the shelter hung beside his desk. Youngest person Mrs. Wilson had ever certified, teaching others what Sullivan had died, making sure he knew. The motorcycle lived in Jackson's garage, maintained weekly by Dylan, who'd learned everything Sullivan taught and more from manuals and YouTube videos, and Tiny stopping by to help with complex repairs. Not ridden yet, 16 was the rule, both legal and emotional age, when Dylan would be ready to handle the responsibility Sullivan had left him. Michael came by most Sundays now, sometimes with Catherine, occasionally with his own teenagers, who'd accepted Dylan as weird cousin figure. Uncle Michael taught Dylan things Jackson couldn't: how to think about college, even though that was years away, how to process grief that didn't resolve on schedule, how to be man who succeeded despite damaged childhood. December 3rd at 4:17 in the afternoon, exactly 1 year since Sullivan's death, Dylan stood at the grave with flowers Catherine had helped him choose. The headstone was simple: Thomas Gunnar Sullivan, 1956-2024, Vietnam veteran, Hells Angels founding member. He learned to be present. Dylan placed the flowers, sat on the cold ground, talked to stone that marked where Sullivan rested. Hi, Gunnar. It's been a year. I'm 11 now, still getting A's. Jackson says you'd be proud. He paused, gathering thoughts. I miss you a lot, especially working on the bike, but I'm keeping it perfect for when I'm 16. Wind blew cold across the cemetery, carrying away words that didn't need audience beyond one. Michael's good. We hang out most weeks. He's not you, but he's trying. And that's what matters, right? Trying. Dylan pulled an envelope from his jacket, the first of 18 letters Sullivan had written, labeled Age 11. He'd opened it this morning, read words Sullivan wrote, knowing he'd be dead when Dylan received them. Your letter said, I'm braver than anyone you met in Vietnam. I'm trying not to let the world make me hard. It's hard to stay soft when things hurt, but I'm trying. He traced the letters carved in stone. I saved 3 more people this year. CPR training at the shelter. 1 guy, 1 woman, 1 kid my age. All cardiac events. I didn't freeze because you taught me not to. The afternoon light slanted across headstones, winter sun weak but present. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. I love you, Gunnar. See you when I see you. He stood, brushed dirt from his jeans, looked at the grave one more time. Behind him, other cars pulled up. Jackson, Sophie, Michael, Catherine, several Hells Angels brothers, Rachel Bennett in her personal car. They'd agreed to meet here, mark anniversary together. Reaper approached, first placed hand on Dylan's shoulder. He'd be proud of you, kid. You think so? No, so. You're living proof his last fight mattered. The group gathered around the headstone, 20 people who'd been changed by one dying man's determination. They didn't pray. Sullivan hadn't been religious, but they stood in silence that held more reverence than ritual. Sophie placed her own drawing at the grave base, Dylan and Sullivan, and her all holding hands, labeled Family Forever. 8-year-old art showing what 7-year-old had understood, that endings didn't erase what existed before. They left as evening approached. Dylan rode home with Jackson and Sophie, homework waiting, dinner to prepare, normalcy that had seemed impossible a year ago. Sullivan's death had hurt exactly as predicted, but his life-brief intersection with Dylan's had mattered more than the hurt. That evening, Dylan sat in the garage working on the Harley. His hands moved with confidence born from repetition, muscle memory, carrying forward what Sullivan had taught. The motorcycle gleamed under fluorescent lights, chrome reflecting boy becoming teenager. Jackson appeared in the doorway. You doing okay? Yeah, missing him, but okay. That's how it works. Missing doesn't mean you're not okay. Dylan tightened the oil filter, cleaned excess with rag. Jackson, do you think Gunnar would be proud? Jackson crossed the garage, knelt beside Dylan. Kid, I know he is. You're exactly what he hoped you'd be: brave, kind, present. That's his legacy right there in you. They finished the work together, covered the motorcycle for winter, went inside where family waited. Dinner happened around the table, spaghetti and laughter, and Sophie's terrible jokes that everyone pretended were funny because she tried. Later that night, Dylan lay in bed looking at tomorrow's calendar date. December 4th, regular Tuesday. School, homework, garage time, dinner, repeat. Normal life that had seemed impossible when he'd been invisible. Sullivan had given him that future that extended past tomorrow, family that showed up, courage that looked like acting scared. 4 weeks of presence mattering more than years of absence. Dylan closed his eyes, thought about Sullivan, about the moment in Vietnam that defined 53 years, about the 4 weeks that had defined Dylan's forever. Good night, Gunnar, he whispered. See you when I see you. Outside, December, cold pressed against windows. Inside, warmth held. Dylan breathed, steady, alive, safe scene. Invisible no longer. Years would pass. Dylan would graduate with honors, serve as Marine combat medic, like Sullivan and Doc before him, saved 247 lives as paramedic. Sophie would become pediatric cardiologist, name her firstborn Thomas. Michael would carry his father's lessons forward, teaching Dylan what Sullivan had shown him, that broken could still build. Rachel would reform CPS protocols, trusting families that didn't fit forms. Jackson would lead Hells Angels with wisdom earned from almost losing daughter and gaining son. And the motorcycle would be ridden at 16 by Dylan, who'd earned it, Sullivan's legacy in chrome and oil and lessons compressed into 4 weeks that multiplied across decades. The last good thing had become countless good things spreading through everyone Sullivan touched. He'd frozen once in Vietnam, carried guilt 53 years, taught one boy not to freeze, and that teaching multiplied infinitely. Show up, be present, try even when failing seems certain. 4 weeks can matter more than decades. Sullivan had done his good thing, Dylan carried it forward, and the story continued, generation after generation, invisible people, being seen, broken people learning they could still build something worth leaving behind. That was legacy, not perfection, just trying right up until the end, hoping it mattered. It had, it did, it would.